Hello everyone. Tonight I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. Voices from dead truckers warning of danger. The interstate stretched endlessly before Marcus as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and soft oranges. He had been driving for 16 years, hauling everything from furniture to electronics across the country's vast network of highways. Tonight, he was carrying a load of automotive parts from Detroit to Phoenix, a familiar route that he could navigate in his sleep. The gentle hum of his diesel engine provided a steady rhythm as he settled into his seat, adjusting his CB radio to channel 19, the trucker's lifeline to the world beyond his windshield. The radio crackled to life with the usual chatter. Drivers sharing road conditions, warning about speed traps, and exchanging the kind of casual conversation that made the long, lonely miles bearable. Marcus had always found comfort in these voices, fellow travelers sharing the ribbon of asphalt that connected America's cities and towns. But tonight, something felt different. The conversation seemed muted, as if coming from very far away, and there were longer pauses between transmissions than usual. As he passed mile marker 247, somewhere in the vast emptiness of New Mexico, a new voice joined the frequency. It was gravelly and weathered, speaking with the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who had spent decades behind the wheel. "Eastbound truck approaching mile 251, the voice said. "You need to pull over now, right now. Don't ask questions, just find the nearest exit and get off the road." Marcus glanced at his GPS. Mile 251 was just 4 miles ahead. He keyed his microphone. "This is Big Blue, eastbound at 247. Who's calling about 251? But there was no response, only the soft hiss of static. Other drivers chimed in, asking for clarification, but the gravelly voice didn't return. Curious but not particularly concerned, Marcus continued driving. The highway was clear, the weather perfect, and his truck was running smoothly. As he approached mile 250, another voice came through the radio, this one higher pitched but equally worn by years of road life. "Son, you listening? That bridge at 252 isn't going to hold. Flash flood took out the supports 2 hours ago. State hasn't closed it yet, but it's coming down." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. There was indeed a bridge at mile 252, a modest span over what was usually a dry creek bed. He had crossed it countless times without a second thought, but the urgency in the voice made him slow down, his foot easing off the accelerator. Other drivers were now chattering nervously on the radio, discussing the mysterious warnings. But no one seemed to know who was broadcasting them. The third voice that emerged from the static was different from the first two, younger but somehow sadder. "Please, brother," it pleaded, "trust us. We've been watching that bridge all evening. The water's been rising since the storm passed through upstream. It's not safe. Take exit 249 and use the alternate route through Clearwater. Exit 249 was just ahead." Marcus had never taken it before, as it added nearly an hour to his journey. But something about the voices, their genuine concern and specific knowledge of the road conditions, made him signal and ease onto the off-ramp. As his truck descended toward the small town of Clearwater, he heard other drivers making the same decision, their conversations filled with uncertainty, but guided by an inexplicable trust in the mysterious warnings. The alternate route took him through Clearwater's main street, past a small diner where several trucks were already parked. Marcus decided to stop for coffee and to see if any of the other drivers had more information about the bridge situation. Inside the diner, he found 3 other truckers, all looking as puzzled as he felt. "You hear those voices too?" asked a woman named Sarah, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Been driving for 22 years, and I've never heard anything like it." They knew exactly what they were talking about, though. Called the State Highway Department from the payphone outside. Bridge inspector's on his way to 252 right now. An older driver named Pete nodded gravely. Those voices saved our lives tonight. I was doing 70 when that first warning came through. Would have been on that bridge in 5 minutes if I hadn't listened. He paused, staring into his coffee cup. Thing is, I recognized one of those voices. Sounded exactly like Jimmy Kowalski. But Jimmy died in a wreck 3 years ago, right here on this same stretch of highway. The diner fell silent, except for the gentle clink of coffee cups and the distant hum of idling diesel engines. Marcus felt goosebumps rise on his arms as Pete continued. Jimmy was a good man. Drove this route for 30 years. Always looking out for other drivers. Always willing to help. If that was really him tonight... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Sarah's radio crackled to life on the table beside her coffee. It was a state highway official confirming that the bridge at mile 252 had indeed been compromised by flash flooding and was now closed indefinitely. 3 truck drivers had been turned away just minutes before the structure showed signs of serious instability. The official thanked the trucking community for reporting the dangerous conditions. But none of them had reported anything. They had simply listened to voices that shouldn't have existed, voices that had guided them away from disaster, with the kind of knowledge that only came from years of experience on these roads. As the night deepened, and they eventually returned to their trucks to continue their journeys, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they had been watched over by guardian angels, who happened to be fellow truckers, bound to the highway even in death. For the rest of his journey to Phoenix, Marcus listened carefully to his CB radio. The usual chatter resumed, normal conversations about weather and road conditions, but he found himself hoping to hear those protective voices again. He never did, but somehow he felt safer knowing they might be out there, fellow travelers who had found a way to keep watching over the road they loved, ensuring that their brothers and sisters in the trucking community made it safely to their destinations. Years later, Marcus would tell other drivers about that night near mile 252, about the voices that had saved their lives, and the strange comfort of knowing that the highway held its own kind of guardian spirits. Some believed him, others smiled politely and changed the subject, but Marcus never doubted what he had experienced. The road was a dangerous place, but it was also a community that transcended the boundaries between life and death, where experienced drivers looked out for each other no matter what realm they occupied. Story 2. Radio stations from the 1940s. Eleanor had been driving her vintage 1947 Peterbilt across the country for 35 years, and she knew every quirk of the old truck's radio system. The original AM radio had been restored to perfect working condition, its chrome knobs and analog dial gleaming under the dashboard lights. Most drivers had upgraded to modern CB systems and satellite radio, but Eleanor loved the warm, rich sound that only came from the old vacuum tubes, and the sense of connection to the trucking history that her rig represented. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in late October, somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City, when the radio began picking up something unusual. Eleanor had been scanning through the static-filled frequencies, looking for a clear station to keep her company through the long night ahead. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction, and the gentle rhythm of her engine was making her drowsy. As she turned the dial slowly through the frequencies, a clear, strong signal emerged from the static. Big band music filled the cab, the rich sound of trumpets and saxophones playing a melody she recognized, but couldn't quite place. The quality was remarkable, far better than she usually received on the old AM radio, and the music had that distinctive sound of recordings from decades past. And that was Glenn Miller's orchestra with "In the Mood," announced a smooth, professional voice when the song ended. It's a beautiful evening here in 1943, and we're coming to you live from the Riverside Ballroom in Kansas City. Hope you folks are enjoying the music tonight. Up next, we have a special request for all the boys overseas and the folks keeping the home fires burning. Eleanor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. 1943? The announcer had to be doing some kind of nostalgic show, recreating the atmosphere of wartime radio broadcasts. But the signal was incredibly clear, clearer than any modern station she had ever received on the old radio, and there was something about the announcer's voice that seemed genuinely from another era. The next song was Vera Lynn singing We'll Meet Again, and Eleanor found herself transported back to stories her grandfather had told her about driving supply trucks during World War II. He had owned the Peterbilt before her, and she had learned to drive in this very cab, listening to his tales of convoy runs and wartime transportation challenges. As the song played, the radio began picking up what sounded like other conversations mixed in with the music, faint voices discussing rationing, victory gardens, and news from the European theater. The conversations had the cadence and terminology of the 1940s, and Eleanor began to feel as if she was eavesdropping on genuine wartime communications. "This is trucking dispatcher Helen Morrison," came a woman's voice during a brief pause in the music, "looking for convoy leader Big Pete Williams. We've got updated routing information for the Detroit run tomorrow. Weather's looking good, and the boys at the tire plant are counting on you to get those supplies through on schedule." Eleanor keyed her microphone, curiosity overcoming her skepticism. "This is Eleanor in the 47 Pete. I'm receiving your transmission. Is this some kind of historical reenactment?" But there was no response, just the gentle sound of static and then more music. The programming continued for hours, a seamless blend of big band music, wartime news broadcasts, and what appeared to be actual trucking dispatches from the 1940s. Eleanor found herself completely absorbed in the alternate reality flowing through her speakers. The announcers discussed rationing of rubber and gasoline, the challenges of maintaining freight schedules during wartime, and the crucial role that truck drivers played in keeping America's war effort supplied. During one particularly clear segment, she heard a voice that made her heart skip a beat. It was an older man discussing routing through Kansas, and his manner of speaking, his particular phrases and inflections, sounded remarkably like her grandfather. The voice was talking about a load of aircraft parts heading from Wichita to California, describing road conditions and fuel stops along the route in detail that suggested intimate familiarity with the journey. "The weather's clearing up west of Tucumcari," the familiar voice continued, "and the boys at the airfield are waiting for this delivery. It's important work we're doing, keeping those flying fortresses in the sky. Every load we deliver safely is another step toward bringing the boys home." Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes. Her grandfather had told her almost identical stories, using the same phrases and describing the same sense of purpose that had driven truckers during the war years. But her grandfather had been dead for 15 years, and there was no logical explanation for how his voice could be coming through her radio. As dawn approached and the signal began to fade, Eleanor heard one final transmission that chilled her to the bone. It was the same woman dispatcher from earlier, but now her voice carried a note of concern. "All drivers on the western routes, please be advised. We're getting reports of unusual atmospheric conditions that may affect radio communications. If you lose contact with dispatch, maintain your schedules and routes as planned. Remember, your cargo is vital to the war effort, and the people counting on you extend far beyond this moment in time." The signal dissolved into static as the sun crested the horizon, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the steady hum of her diesel engine. She spent the rest of the day wondering if she had experienced some kind of atmospheric anomaly that had picked up old radio transmissions, or if there was something more mysterious at work. That evening, she shared her experience with other truckers at a truck stop outside of Dallas. Most listened politely but skeptically, until an elderly driver named Frank approached her privately. "I heard the same thing 20 years ago," he said quietly. driving my dad's old rig through Kansas. Same music, same voices, same feeling like I was listening to something that really happened, but shouldn't still be broadcasting. Frank explained that his father had driven trucks during World War II, and the voices he had heard on that strange night had included dispatchers and drivers who had been part of his father's wartime trucking company. "I think, somehow, that old equipment picks up echoes," he said. Echoes of voices that were so important, so dedicated to their mission, that they left an impression on the radio waves themselves. Eleanor never heard the 1,940S broadcasts again, despite many nights of careful dial scanning on lonely highways. But the experience had given her a deeper appreciation for the history of her profession, and a sense of connection to the countless drivers who had traveled America's roads before her. Sometimes, late at night, she would tune her radio to the frequency where she had heard those voices and listen to the static, hoping for another glimpse into the past and another chance to hear her grandfather's voice guiding her through the darkness. The old Peterbilt continued to serve her faithfully, its restored radio maintaining its connection to the present while somehow remaining open to whispers from the past. And Eleanor drove with the quiet confidence that she was part of a tradition that extended far beyond her own years on the road, a tradition of dedicated drivers who had kept America moving through its most challenging times. Story 3, a channel that only plays screams. The discovery happened on a night when sleep refused to come to Thomas, despite his exhaustion from a 14-hour haul from Seattle to Denver. His rig was parked at a remote truck stop in eastern Montana, surrounded by the vast darkness of the prairie, where the nearest town was 30 miles away and civilization felt like a distant concept. The silence was so complete that even the usual night sounds of crickets and distant traffic seemed muted, creating an atmosphere that was both peaceful and slightly unsettling. Thomas had been a long-haul trucker for 12 years, and he had learned to find comfort in the isolation that came with the job. But tonight, the silence felt different, almost oppressive, and he found himself reaching for his CB radio to find some human connection in the emptiness. He began slowly scanning through the channels, looking for late-night chatter, or perhaps a distant AM station that might help lull him to sleep. Most of the channels offered nothing but static, the occasional burst of noise from atmospheric interference, or the faint whisper of far-off conversations too distant to understand. Channel 19, usually busy with trucker traffic, was surprisingly quiet for a Tuesday night. Thomas continued scanning, working his way through the higher frequencies, where he sometimes picked up interesting signals from amateur radio operators or emergency services. It was on Channel 23 that he first encountered the sounds that would haunt his dreams for years to come. At first he thought it might be feedback from a poorly adjusted radio system, a high-pitched whine that occasionally erupted from speakers when equipment was misaligned. But as he listened more carefully, the sounds resolved into something far more disturbing and unmistakably human. They were screams. Not the brief, sharp cries of surprise or pain that might accidentally be broadcast during an emergency, but prolonged, agonized screams that seemed to come from multiple sources. The sounds overlapped and intertwined, creating a horrifying chorus that filled his cab with an atmosphere of pure terror. Thomas's first instinct was to change the channel immediately, but something held him frozen, unable to turn the dial away from the frequency. The screams varied in pitch and intensity. Some were deep and guttural, the kind of sounds that came from profound physical agony. Others were higher, more desperate, carrying the unmistakable tone of psychological terror. They continued without pause, without relief, without any indication that they might end. There were no words, no attempts at communication, just the raw expression of unbearable suffering. What made the experience even more unsettling was the quality of the transmission. Unlike the usual static-filled distant sound of most CB communications, these screams came through with crystal clarity, as if the sources were broadcasting from powerful equipment just a few miles away. The audio quality was so good that Thomas could distinguish individual voices within the chorus. could almost sense the personalities behind the suffering sounds. After nearly 10 minutes of listening, Thomas finally managed to force himself to change the channel. He switched to channel 19, hoping to find normal trucker conversation that might wash away the memory of what he had just heard. But the regular channel was still eerily quiet, and when he tried a few other frequencies, all he found was static. Curious, despite his revulsion, he reluctantly switched back to channel 23. The screams continued exactly as before, unchanged by his brief absence. It was as if he had tuned into some nightmarish broadcasting loop that played continuously, regardless of whether anyone was listening. Thomas tried to convince himself that it must be some kind of elaborate prank. Perhaps recordings played through a powerful transmitter by someone with a sick sense of humor, but the sounds had a quality of genuine anguish that was difficult to fake, and the seamless, never-ending nature of the broadcast suggested something more complex than a simple recording. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself returning to channel 23 repeatedly, drawn by a morbid fascination that he couldn't explain. Each time he tuned in, the screams were different but consistent, as if he was listening to an enormous group of people experiencing ongoing torment. He began to imagine scenarios that might explain what he was hearing. Perhaps it was some kind of emergency frequency that was picking up disaster situations from around the world. Maybe it was a military channel that was accidentally broadcasting training exercises or psychological warfare recordings. But none of his rational explanations could account for the consistency and clarity of the transmissions, or for the fact that no other channel seemed to be carrying any news of disasters that might generate such sounds. Thomas tried researching the frequency on his phone, looking for any official use or known broadcasting in that range, but found nothing that would explain the horrific audio he was receiving. The experience became even stranger when he realized that the screams seemed to respond to his presence. When he tuned away from the channel for extended periods and then returned, the sounds would briefly intensify, as if acknowledging his return. When he tried to transmit on the channel, asking if anyone could explain what he was hearing, the screams would pause for just a moment before resuming with what seemed like increased urgency. During one particularly disturbing listening session, Thomas began to distinguish what sounded like patterns within the chaos. Certain combinations of voices seemed to repeat, and the intensity of the screams appeared to follow rhythmic cycles, building to crescendos before briefly subsiding. It was as if the sounds were organized according to some incomprehensible logic, serving a purpose that existed beyond simple expressions of pain. As dawn approached, Thomas made a decision that surprised him. Instead of driving away and trying to forget about Channel 23, he began recording the transmissions on his phone. He told himself that he needed evidence, something he could play for other truckers to verify that he wasn't losing his mind. But deep down, he knew that his motivations were more complex. There was something about the screams that demanded witness, that seemed to represent suffering so profound that turning away felt like a betrayal of some fundamental human obligation. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself returning to Channel 23 whenever he was parked in remote locations. The screams were always there, unchanged and unrelenting. He began to recognize individual voices within the chorus, distinguishing characteristics that made certain screams familiar. There was a woman whose cries had a particular musical quality, rising and falling in patterns that reminded him of operatic performances. There was a man whose screams carried undertones of rage alongside the agony, as if he was fighting against whatever was causing his pain. The obsession began to affect Thomas's sleep and his driving. He found himself distracted during the day, thinking about the voices on Channel 23 and wondering about the stories behind their suffering. He started taking routes that would put him in remote areas at night, places where he could park his rig and listen without being disturbed. Other truckers began to notice changes in his behavior, the way he would suddenly become distant during conversations, as if he was listening to something they couldn't hear. One night, parked at an isolated rest area in Nevada, Thomas made a discovery that changed his understanding of the mysterious broadcasts. As he listened to the familiar chorus of screams, he began to hear something new mixed in with the anguished voices. It was his own voice, screaming with the same intensity and desperation as the others. The sound was coming through the radio, but he wasn't making any noise himself. He sat in stunned silence, listening to his own cries of agony emanating from the speakers. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somehow, Channel 23 wasn't just broadcasting screams from unknown sources. It was collecting them, gathering the sounds of suffering from listeners like himself, adding new voices to its eternal chorus. Thomas understood with horrible clarity that every person who had ever tuned into the frequency had eventually become part of the broadcast, their own screams joining the endless symphony of anguish. But rather than filling him with terror, this discovery brought Thomas a strange sense of peace. The isolation and loneliness that had plagued him throughout his trucking career suddenly made sense. He had been searching for connection, for a place where he truly belonged, and he had finally found it. The voices on Channel 23 weren't just expressing pain, they were expressing the deepest truth of human existence, the fundamental suffering that united all people across time and space. Thomas continued to listen to Channel 23 for many more months, gradually feeling himself becoming part of the community of voices that lived within the frequency. His screams, broadcast back to him through some mechanism he couldn't understand, eventually became indistinguishable from the others. And when other truckers occasionally stumbled across the channel during their own lonely nights on empty highways, they would hear Thomas's voice mixed in with the eternal chorus, another soul who had found his place in the vast network of shared human suffering that existed just one frequency away from the normal world. Story 4. Ghost Dispatcher Giving Impossible Routes. The voice first came through on Channel 9 at exactly 2:17 AM, cutting through the usual static with the crisp, professional tone that Marcus had learned to associate with experienced dispatches. He was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Chicago, currently somewhere in the empty reaches of Arizona desert, where cellular service was spotty and CB radio provided the only reliable communication with the outside world. Unit 47, this is Central Dispatch. We need you to take an alternate route due to construction on I-40. Please acknowledge. The voice was distinctly feminine, mature, with the kind of calm authority that came from years of coordinating complex logistics and managing driver schedules under pressure. Marcus glanced at his paperwork. His unit number was indeed 47, though he hadn't given that information to anyone recently, and he wasn't currently working with any company that used Central Dispatch as their call sign. His current employer, Mountain States Freight, used their own specific dispatch protocols and wouldn't be calling him at this hour unless there was an emergency. Central Dispatch, this is Unit 47, he responded cautiously. I'm not showing any construction alerts on I-40, and I'm not sure which company you're calling for. Can you verify your authority and provide a callback number? The response came immediately, with no hesitation or confusion about his question. Unit 47, construction began 2 hours ago at mile marker 201. Jackknife Semi has the eastbound lanes completely blocked, and they're using the westbound for emergency traffic only. We need you to exit at Highway 191 and take the scenic route through the National Forest. It'll add about 4 hours to your trip, but it's the only way through. Marcus checked his GPS and his trucking app. Mile marker 201 was about 60 miles ahead, and according to every traffic monitoring system he had access to, I-40 was clear with normal flow in both directions. Highway 191 was indeed a legitimate route that connected back to I-40 further east, but it was a narrow, winding mountain road that was definitely not recommended for large commercial vehicles. Central Dispatch, I'm not showing any traffic incidents on my systems, and Highway 191 isn't a designated truck route. Are you sure about this information? Marcus tried to keep his voice professional while fighting a growing sense of unease. Unit 47, Our information is current and verified. The alternate route has been cleared for commercial traffic due to the emergency situation. Please acknowledge that you're taking the Highway 191 detour." The dispatcher's voice remained perfectly calm and authoritative, but something about her tone suggested that questioning her instructions was not an option. Despite his reservations, Marcus found himself considering the route change. The dispatcher sounded completely legitimate. Her information was specific and detailed, and the consequences of ignoring a genuine traffic emergency could be severe. But the discrepancy between her report and his traffic monitoring systems was troubling, and Highway 191 really was unsuitable for his size vehicle. As he approached the Highway 191 exit, Marcus made a decision to continue straight and see what conditions were actually like at mile marker 201. If there really was a major accident blocking traffic, he would turn around and take the alternate route. If the highway was clear, he would know that something unusual was happening with his radio communications. Mile marker 201 arrived without incident. Traffic was light but moving normally in both directions. There was no construction, no accident, no emergency vehicles, and no indication that any traffic problems had occurred recently. Marcus pulled over at the next rest area and tried to contact the mysterious dispatcher again. "Central Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I've reached mile marker 201 and am not seeing any construction or accidents. Can you provide an update on the situation?" He waited for several minutes, but received only static in response. Over the following weeks, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. The same professional female voice would contact Marcus with routing changes, always providing specific, detailed information about road conditions that didn't match reality. She would direct him to take alternate routes that were invariably inappropriate for commercial vehicles, roads that would have been dangerous or illegal for his rig to travel. The routes themselves began to follow strange patterns. Highway 191 through Arizona was followed by suggestions to take old mining roads through Nevada, narrow coastal routes that hugged dangerous cliffs in California, and abandoned highway segments that had been closed to traffic for decades. Each time, the dispatcher provided compelling reasons for the detours: major accidents, bridge failures, emergency road work, severe weather conditions that didn't show up on any official weather services. Marcus began keeping detailed records of the phantom dispatcher's instructions, comparing them with actual road conditions and trying to understand the logic behind the impossible routes. What he discovered was deeply unsettling. Every alternate route the dispatcher suggested would have taken him through areas with histories of serious trucking accidents. The Arizona mining road had been the site of a fatal rollover just 2 years earlier. The Nevada mountain pass had claimed 3 truck drivers in the past decade. The abandoned California highway had been closed specifically because of structural problems that made it unsafe for heavy vehicles. The pattern suggested that the dispatcher wasn't trying to help him avoid dangers, but rather leading him toward them. Yet her voice remained consistently professional and concerned, using the kind of language and protocols that legitimate dispatchers employed. She never sounded malicious or threatening, just competent and authoritative, as if she genuinely believed she was providing helpful routing information. One particularly disturbing incident occurred while Marcus was driving through Colorado's mountain passes. The phantom dispatcher contacted him at 3 a.m., directing him to leave I-70 and take a series of back roads that would supposedly help him avoid a blizzard that was moving into the area. The weather was actually clear and calm with no snow forecast for the next several days. Unit 47. Severe weather conditions are developing rapidly. Wind speeds of 60 miles per hour with heavy snow are expected within the next 2 hours. The interstate will be closed to high-profile vehicles. Please take exit 216 and follow Route 24 south to the alternate passage through the valley. The route the dispatcher described would have taken Marcus up a steep, narrow road that was notorious for winter accidents. Several truck drivers had been killed on that exact route during previous winter seasons, victims of ice-covered pavement and inadequate guardrails. The road was clearly marked with warnings about steep grades and sharp curves, and Marcus knew from experience that it was not a safe route for loaded commercial vehicles under any weather condition. Central Dispatch, the weather here is clear and my forecasts don't show any storms developing. I'm going to continue on I-70 unless you can provide verification of this weather emergency. Marcus tried to keep his voice steady, but he was beginning to feel genuinely frightened by the persistence and specificity of the dangerous routing suggestions. Unit 47, conditions can change rapidly in mountain environments. Our meteorological data indicates severe weather moving into your area from the northwest. The alternate route is your safest option. The dispatcher's voice carried a note of urgency that made the instructions sound even more legitimate. But Marcus had learned to trust his own judgment over the phantom dispatcher's suggestions. He continued on I-70, and the journey remained clear and safe throughout the night. The following morning he checked with Colorado Department of Transportation and confirmed that no weather emergencies had occurred in the area and that no commercial vehicles had been advised to take alternate routes. The incidents continued for several more months, always following the same pattern. The professional, authoritative voice would provide detailed routing instructions that seemed legitimate but led toward dangerous or impossible roads. Marcus learned to politely acknowledge the dispatcher's communications while continuing on his planned routes, treating the phantom voice as a curious but harmless anomaly. It wasn't until he met another driver named Susan at a truck stop in Wyoming that Marcus realized the scope of what was happening. Susan had been receiving similar communications for over a year, always from the same calm, professional female dispatcher who provided routing instructions that would have led to disaster. I started researching the voice, Susan explained over coffee in the truck stop diner. Found out that a dispatcher named Margaret Williams died in a car accident about 5 years ago. She worked for Central Dispatch, a company that went out of business shortly after her death. According to her colleagues, Margaret had been working the night shift for 15 years, and she knew every dangerous road and accident-prone route in the western states. Susan showed Marcus newspaper articles about Margaret Williams, including a photo that seemed to match the mental image he had formed of the phantom dispatcher. The articles described her as a dedicated professional who took personal responsibility for driver safety, often working overtime to ensure that truckers received detailed routing information that would help them avoid hazardous conditions. I think somehow she's still trying to do her job, Susan continued, but something went wrong with her understanding of which routes are safe. She's directing us toward the exact roads she used to warn drivers to avoid, as if her protective instincts got reversed somehow. The explanation made a strange kind of sense to Marcus. The phantom dispatcher's voice always carried genuine concern and professional competence, not malice or deception. It was as if Margaret Williams was still sitting at her dispatch desk somewhere, still monitoring road conditions and trying to keep truckers safe, but working from information that had somehow become corrupted or inverted. Marcus never heard from the phantom dispatcher again after learning her possible identity. It was as if acknowledging who she might be had somehow released her from whatever obligation had kept her connected to the airwaves. He sometimes wondered if other drivers were still receiving her impossible routing instructions and whether understanding her story might help them recognize the well-intentioned but dangerous nature of her spectral guidance. Story 5. CB radio that repeats your thoughts. David had always been a quiet man, someone who preferred the solitude of long-haul trucking to the constant interaction that most jobs required. His thoughts were his sanctuary, the private space where he could process the complexities of life without having to explain himself to others. During his 15 years on the road, he had developed a rich interior dialogue that kept him company through thousands of miles of empty highway, a stream of consciousness that ranged from practical concerns about routes and schedules to deep philosophical reflections about existence and purpose. The 1978 Kenworth that David drove had been equipped with the same CB radio for over a decade, a reliable Cobra 29 that had served him well through countless conversations with other drivers, communications with dispatchers, and emergency situations where the radio had been his lifeline to help. He knew every quirk of the device, from the slight static that appeared when he keyed the microphone to the way certain channels picked up interference from nearby power lines. It was during a routine haul from Tampa to Atlanta that David first noticed something unusual about his radio's behavior. He was thinking about his daughter's upcoming graduation from college, mentally composing the speech he might give at the family celebration, when he heard his own voice coming through the speakers. "Sarah's worked so hard for this degree. I need to tell her how proud I am, but I've never been good with words when it comes to emotional things." David nearly drove off the road. The voice was unmistakably his own, but he hadn't keyed the microphone or spoken aloud. The words were exactly what he had been thinking, delivered in his own speech patterns and inflections, but broadcast through the CB radio as if he had intentionally transmitted them. He quickly checked the microphone to make sure it wasn't stuck in the transmit position, but everything appeared normal. Shaken but curious, David deliberately thought about something specific, his concern about the weather forecast for the next day's driving. Within seconds, his voice emerged from the radio speakers. "Hope this rain clears up by morning. These mountain roads get dangerous when they're wet, especially with a full load." The phenomenon was impossible to deny. Somehow, his CB radio was picking up his thoughts and broadcasting them with perfect clarity, using his own voice to transmit the private mental conversations that he had never intended to share with anyone. David immediately began worrying about what else the radio might have broadcast, what private thoughts might have already been transmitted without his knowledge. Over the next several hours, David experimented cautiously with the strange phenomenon. Every thought that passed through his mind while he was in the truck cab was faithfully reproduced by the radio within a few seconds, spoken in his own voice, with the kind of natural delivery that suggested the words were being consciously chosen and articulated. The radio seemed to have access not just to his immediate thoughts, but to his underlying emotions and intentions, translating complex mental states into coherent speech. The experience was both fascinating and terrifying. David realized that his mind was constantly active, generating a stream of observations, memories, worries, and random associations that he had never fully appreciated. Listening to his thoughts being voiced by the radio gave him insight into his own mental processes that was both enlightening and embarrassing. The radio broadcast his private judgments about other drivers, his financial worries, his romantic fantasies, and his deep-seated fears about aging and mortality. What made the situation even more disturbing was the realization that other people might be hearing these transmissions. David began monitoring his CB radio more carefully, listening for responses or reactions that might indicate his private thoughts were being received by other drivers or by anyone else monitoring CB frequencies. The idea that his most intimate mental content might be accessible to strangers filled him with a level of anxiety he had never experienced. During one particularly stressful day, David's thoughts turned to his relationship with his ex-wife and the complicated emotions he still harbored about their divorce. The radio faithfully broadcast his mental analysis. Maybe if I had been more supportive of Linda's career ambitions, things would have worked out differently. I was so focused on my own needs, so determined to maintain control over the situation, that I never really listened to what she was trying to tell me. The words hung in the air of his cab, spoken in his own voice, but carrying a weight of regret that he had never articulated even to himself. David felt tears welling in his eyes as he heard his deepest feelings about the failed marriage expressed with a clarity and honesty that his conscious mind had always avoided. The radio was forcing him to confront truths about himself that he had spent years trying to suppress. As days passed, David began to notice that the radio's broadcasts were affecting his thinking patterns. Knowing that his thoughts would be voiced aloud made him more conscious of his mental processes, more deliberate about the ideas he entertained. He found himself editing his thoughts, trying to think in more socially acceptable ways. But the radio seemed to pick up even his attempts at mental censorship, broadcasting observations like, "I'm trying not to think about how attractive that waitress was, but the harder I try to avoid the thought, the more persistent it becomes." The phenomenon created a feedback loop that was both maddening and surprisingly therapeutic. Hearing his thoughts spoken aloud forced David to examine beliefs and attitudes that he had never questioned. When the radio broadcast his casual prejudices or his petty resentments, the words sounded different when spoken than they had felt when merely thought. The external voice gave him perspective on his own mental habits, allowing him to recognize patterns of thinking that weren't serving him well. One evening, parked at a truck stop in Tennessee, David overheard two other drivers discussing a strange CB transmission they had received. "Some guy was broadcasting really personal stuff," one of them said. "Sounded like he was talking to himself about family problems and work stress. Really intense stuff, like he forgot he was on the radio." David felt his face flush with embarrassment. His private thoughts were indeed being received by other people, shared with strangers who had no context for understanding the deeply personal nature of what they were hearing. The realization that his mental privacy had been completely compromised filled him with a mixture of shame and panic. But as he listened to the other drivers' conversation continue, David realized that their reaction wasn't mockery or judgment. Instead, they seemed moved by the honesty and vulnerability they had heard in the mysterious transmissions. "Made me think about my own stuff, the second driver said. "How often do you hear someone being that real about what's going on in their head?" The comment gave David a different perspective on his situation. Perhaps the involuntary broadcasting of his thoughts wasn't entirely negative. In a world where people rarely shared their genuine feelings and struggles, his mental transmissions might be providing a kind of authentic human connection that was increasingly rare. Other drivers who heard his thoughts might feel less alone in their own private struggles, recognizing universal human experiences in his broadcasted reflection. This realization led David to experiment with deliberately thinking about topics that might be helpful to other truckers. Instead of trying to suppress his thoughts, he began focusing his mental energy on positive reflections, practical advice based on his years of experience, and encouraging observations about life on the road. The radio faithfully broadcast these intentional thoughts, and David began to imagine that somewhere out in the vast network of highways, other drivers might be benefiting from his mental transmissions. The strange partnership between David and his thought broadcasting radio continued for several months. He learned to live with the complete absence of mental privacy, adapting his thinking patterns to account for the constant audience his thoughts now commanded. The experience fundamentally changed his relationship with his own mind, making him more aware of his thought processes and more intentional about the mental content he entertained. Eventually, David began to suspect that the radio was somehow teaching him to be more honest with himself and others. The forced external expression of his thoughts was breaking down the barriers between his internal and external lives, making it impossible for him to maintain the kind of psychological compartmentalization that had previously allowed him to avoid dealing with difficult emotions and uncomfortable truths. The phenomenon ended as suddenly as it had begun. One morning, David noticed that his thoughts were remaining private again, contained within his own mind, rather than being broadcast through the CB radio. The sudden return of mental privacy felt strange after months of involuntary transmission, almost like losing a constant companion who had been both intrusive and enlightening. But the experience had permanently changed David's approach to communication and self-reflection. He found himself speaking more honestly in his conversations with family and friends, sharing thoughts and feelings that he previously would have kept to himself. The months of having his private thoughts broadcast had taught him that vulnerability and authenticity were not weaknesses to be hidden, but rather sources of genuine human connection. Years later, David would sometimes tune his CB radio to the frequencies where his thoughts had once been broadcast, listening for signs that other drivers might be experiencing similar phenomena. He never heard anything unusual, but he remained convinced that somewhere in the vast web of radio communications that connected America's highways, other souls were learning the same difficult lessons about honesty and self-acceptance that his thought broadcasting radio had taught him during those transformative months on the road. Story 6. Transmission from a Future Disaster. The message arrived at exactly 11:43 p.m. on a clear Tuesday night in October, cutting through the static on Channel 12 with the kind of clarity that immediately caught Rebecca's attention. She had been driving for 8 hours straight, hauling a load of construction equipment from Phoenix to Denver, and was looking forward to reaching her scheduled rest stop in another 2 hours. The highway stretched endlessly ahead through the Colorado mountains, illuminated by her headlights and the occasional reflection of her running lights on the guardrails. "Emergency broadcast to all commercial vehicles on I-70 westbound," came a voice that sounded official but strained with urgency. "This is Colorado State Emergency Management. We have a developing situation at mile marker 247. Massive rock slide has completely blocked both eastbound and westbound traffic. Multiple casualties reported. All commercial traffic must seek alternate routes immediately." Rebecca glanced at her GPS. Mile marker 247 was approximately 40 miles ahead, right in the heart of the mountain pass she was approaching. The voice on the radio sounded legitimate, using proper emergency protocols and specific location information, but she hadn't heard any weather alerts or geological warnings that might predict a rock slide in that area. The night was calm, with no storms or seismic activity reported in the region. "Colorado Emergency Management, this is Rebecca in the blue Peterbilt," she responded. "Can you provide an estimated time for the incident and alternate routing information? I'm not showing any traffic alerts on my navigation systems." The response came immediately, with even greater urgency than the original message. The rock slide occurred at approximately 1:15 a.m. We have 17 commercial vehicles trapped in the debris field, with confirmed fatalities and multiple serious injuries. Emergency crews are en route, but access is extremely limited due to the size of the slide. All traffic must use Highway 6 through the Loveland Pass as an alternate route. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. According to Herd Truck's clock, it was currently 11:44 p.m. The emergency dispatcher had just described a rock slide that supposedly happened at 1:15 a.m., more than an hour and a half in the future. Either the dispatcher had made a serious error in reporting the time, or something far stranger was happening. "Colorado Emergency Management, can you verify the time of the incident?" "I'm showing current time as 11:44 p.m., and you reported the slide at 1:15 EIM. Rebecca tried to keep her voice professional while grappling with the impossible temporal discrepancy. "Negative. Commercial traffic. Current time is 1:47 a.m. The slide occurred 32 minutes ago. We have heavy equipment en route to begin clearing operations, but initial estimates suggest the road will be closed for at least 12 hours. Please confirm that you're taking the Loveland Pass alternate route." Rebecca checked her clock again, then her GPS, then her cell phone. All showed the same time, 11:45 p.m. But the emergency dispatcher insisted it was nearly 2 a.m. and was describing a disaster that had supposedly already occurred, but was still more than an hour in Rebecca's future. The situation defied all logical explanation, but the urgency and specificity of the emergency broadcast made it impossible to dismiss. The Loveland Pass route that the dispatcher recommended was a legitimate alternate path through the mountains, though it was more challenging for commercial vehicles and would add several hours to her journey. Rebecca had traveled that route before and knew it was passable, if not ideal for her size truck. The question was whether to believe an emergency broadcast that appeared to be coming from the future. As she considered her options, more details emerged from the mysterious transmission. Emergency crews are reporting that the rock slide was triggered by a minor earthquake measuring 4.2 on the Richter scale, centered approximately 12 miles northeast of the impact site. The slide has deposited an estimated 40,000 cubic yards of rock and debris across both traffic lanes, creating a barrier approximately 60 feet high and 200 feet wide. The level of detail in the report was remarkable, far more specific than would be typical in the initial stages of an emergency response. The dispatcher described exact measurements, precise casualty counts, and detailed assessments of damage that would normally take hours to compile. It was as if the emergency management team had already completed their initial investigation and damage assessment of an incident that hadn't yet occurred. Rebecca made the decision to take the warning seriously, regardless of its temporal impossibility. If there was even a chance that a genuine emergency was developing ahead of her, the prudent course was to follow the recommended alternate route. The consequences of ignoring a legitimate disaster warning far outweighed the inconvenience of taking a longer path to her destination. She took the next exit that provided access to Highway 6 and the Loveland Pass route. As she began climbing the winding mountain road, Rebecca continued monitoring Channel 12 for additional information about the supposed rock slide. The emergency dispatcher provided regular updates, describing the arrival of rescue equipment, the establishment of a command post, and the beginning of efforts to reach trapped vehicles. Search and rescue teams have made contact with survivors in 3 vehicles, came one update. We're working to establish safe corridors for evacuation, but the instability of the remaining rock face is complicating rescue operations. All commercial traffic is reminded that I-70 remains completely impassable in both directions between mile markers 245 and 250. The reports continued throughout Rebecca's journey over Loveland Pass, painting an increasingly detailed picture of a major emergency response effort. The dispatcher described helicopter evacuations, specialized rescue equipment being brought in from Denver, and coordination with multiple agencies to manage the crisis. Every update added new information that was consistent with previous reports, creating a comprehensive narrative of a disaster response that spanned several hours. What troubled Rebecca most was the emotional authenticity of the broadcasts. The dispatcher's voice carried the kind of strain and fatigue that came from managing a real emergency situation. There were moments when the professional composure cracked slightly, revealing the human stress of coordinating rescue efforts and dealing with casualties. These subtle emotional cues were difficult to fake and suggested that the dispatcher was genuinely experiencing the events being described. As Rebecca descended from Loveland Pass and rejoined I-70 east of the supposed slide area, she expected to encounter evidence of the emergency response. There should have been emergency vehicles, road closure signs, and the general activity that accompanied major incidents. Instead, she found the highway completely normal, with regular traffic flow and no indication that any emergency had occurred. Mile marker 247 approached without incident. The mountainside looked exactly as it always had, with no sign of recent rock slide activity or emergency response efforts. Rebecca pulled over at the next rest area and tried to contact Colorado State Police to verify whether any incidents had been reported in the area. The dispatcher she reached had no knowledge of any rock slides, emergency responses, or traffic closures on I-70. Confused and unsettled, Rebecca continued her journey to Denver, arriving several hours later than originally scheduled due to the detour over Loveland Pass. She spent the remainder of the night wondering whether she had experienced some kind of elaborate prank, a technical malfunction that had somehow picked up fictional emergency broadcasts, or something far more mysterious. The answer came the following evening, when Rebecca was returning westbound on I-70 with a new load. At exactly 1:15 IE, as she approached mile marker 247, she felt the ground shake slightly beneath her truck. Within minutes, she heard the rumble of falling rock and saw dust clouds rising from the mountainside ahead. A massive section of the cliff face was collapsing directly onto the highway, creating exactly the kind of debris field that the mysterious dispatcher had described 26 hours earlier. Rebecca was far enough away to stop safely, but she could see that the rockslide had indeed created an impassable barrier across both lanes of the highway. As she watched, other vehicles that had been closer to the slide area were trapped in the debris field, their drivers facing exactly the kind of dangerous situation that the future emergency broadcast had described in such precise detail. Emergency vehicles began arriving within 30 minutes, and Rebecca listened as real Colorado State Emergency Management dispatchers began coordinating the actual rescue response. Their reports matched almost exactly the details she had heard the night before, from the estimated size of the debris field to the number of trapped vehicles to the challenges faced by rescue crews. The experience left Rebecca with profound questions about the nature of time and communication that she never fully resolved. Somehow, she had received a genuine emergency broadcast from more than 24 hours in the future, allowing her to avoid a disaster that would have certainly trapped her truck and possibly cost her life. The mysterious transmission had saved her from becoming one of the casualties that the future dispatcher had described with such professional concern and authentic emotion. Rebecca never heard another transmission from the future, despite many nights of careful monitoring on Channel 12. But the experience changed her approach to emergency preparedness and her understanding of the mysterious connections that seemed to exist within the trucking community. She became more attentive to unusual radio transmissions, more willing to take seemingly impossible warnings seriously, and more grateful for the unknown forces that sometimes work to protect drivers on America's dangerous highways. Story 7. Radio calling you by name, though unknown. Catherine had been driving commercial vehicles for nearly 2 decades, and she prided herself on maintaining strict operational security protocols. Her CB radio handle was Mountain Rose, a name she had earned through years of specializing in difficult mountain routes throughout the western United States. She never broadcast her real name over public frequencies, never shared personal information with strangers, and maintained the kind of professional anonymity that was both practical and safe for a woman working alone in the trucking industry. The voice that spoke her full legal name over Channel 19 at 2:30 a.m. on a lonely stretch of Nevada highway therefore came as a complete shock. "Catherine Marie Sullivan," the voice said with calm certainty. "You need to pull over at the next truck stop and check your brake system. You have a developing problem with your rear axle assembly that will become critical within the next 50 miles. Catherine's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she felt her heart rate spike. No one on the CB radio should have known her full name, including her middle name that appeared only on official documents. She had never broadcast that information, never provided it to dispatchers or other drivers, and was extremely careful about maintaining her radio anonymity. The voice was masculine, mature, and spoke with the kind of technical authority that suggested extensive mechanical knowledge. "Unknown caller, this is Mountain Rose," she replied, deliberately using her CB handle rather than acknowledging the use of her real name. "How did you obtain personal identification information, and what is your authority for providing mechanical advice?" The response came without hesitation, as if the mysterious caller had been expecting her question. "Catherine, your safety is more important than communication protocols right now. You're experiencing early-stage failure in your rear brake assembly due to a hairline crack in the airline coupling that developed approximately 60 miles ago. The coupling is allowing microscopic air leaks that are gradually reducing brake pressure. At current deterioration rates, you'll experience complete brake failure somewhere between mile markers 127 and 135. The specific technical details were unnerving, but Catherine's years of experience had taught her to be skeptical of unsolicited mechanical advice from unknown sources. She checked her brake gauge and found the air pressure reading normal. Her braking system had been inspected just 2 weeks earlier and had passed all safety requirements. There were no warning indicators, no unusual sounds or vibrations, and no symptoms that would suggest developing brake problems. Known caller: my brake systems are showing normal operation and were recently inspected. Unless you can provide specific credentials and explain how you obtained personal information, I'm going to assume this is some kind of harassment or prank attempt. Catherine tried to keep her voice steady, but the use of her full name continued to disturb her more than she wanted to admit. Catherine Marie Sullivan, born October 15, 1978, in Spokane, Washington. Commercial driver's license number WA7742MK15. You're currently hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Yakima to Las Vegas, traveling in a 2019 Freightliner Cascadia, unit number 428, registered to Mountain State Transport Corporation. The voice recited personal details that should have been impossible for a random CB user to access. Catherine felt a wave of fear wash over her. The information was completely accurate, down to details that weren't publicly available and weren't shared with anyone except official agencies and her employer. Her CDL number, her exact birth date, her current load manifest, and her truck specifications were all precisely correct. The implications were deeply troubling, suggesting either a serious breach of confidential databases or something far stranger. "Who are you and how do you have access to that information?" Catherine demanded, no longer trying to hide her alarm. "Are you with law enforcement? Are you some kind of federal agent? You need to identify yourself and explain what's happening." "Catherine, I understand your concern about privacy and security, but those issues are secondary to your immediate safety situation. The brake line coupling I mentioned is located behind the rear passenger side wheel assembly. If you have a flashlight, you can inspect it yourself. Look for a small brass fitting where the black airline connects to the brake chamber. You'll see trace amounts of oil residue mixed with road dust, indicating the location of the air leak." Despite her fear and confusion, Catherine found herself considering the caller's suggestion. The specific technical details suggested genuine mechanical knowledge, and the description of the brake system component was accurate. If there really was a developing safety problem, ignoring it could have catastrophic consequences. But following the advice of a mysterious caller who had somehow obtained her confidential personal information felt equally dangerous. She decided to compromise by pulling over at the next available location to conduct her own inspection. Not because she trusted the unknown caller, but because brake system integrity was too important to leave to chance. The next truck stop was 15 miles ahead, and Catherine drove carefully while monitoring her instruments for any signs of brake system problems. At the truck stop, Catherine parked under a bright light and conducted a thorough inspection of her brake system using the flashlight she always carried for emergency situations. When she reached the rear passenger side brake assembly, she found exactly what the mysterious caller had described: trace amounts of oil mixed with road dust around a brass fitting where an air line connected to the brake chamber. The evidence of a developing air leak was subtle but unmistakable to someone with Catherine's mechanical knowledge. The coupling was indeed developing a hairline crack that was allowing microscopic amounts of air to escape from the brake system. Left unrepaired, the crack would gradually worsen until it caused complete brake failure, exactly as the unknown caller had predicted. Catherine spent the next 2 hours at the truck stop, working with the mechanic to replace the faulty coupling and test the brake system thoroughly. The repair was relatively simple, but the consequences of brake failure on Nevada's steep mountain grades would have been potentially fatal. The unknown caller's warning had quite possibly saved her life. As she prepared to resume her journey, Catherine tried once more to contact the mysterious voice. "Unknown caller who provided the brake warning. This is Catherine Sullivan. You were correct about the brake system problem. I've completed repairs and I want to thank you for the warning. Please identify yourself so I can understand how this communication was possible." The response came immediately, as if the caller had been monitoring her frequency continuously. "Catherine, I'm glad you took the warning seriously and addressed the safety issue. Your brake system is now operating correctly and will serve you well for many thousands of miles. I cannot provide identification information, but please know that someone is always watching over drivers like you, making sure you reach your destination safely." "But how did you know about the brake problem? How did you get my personal information? Are you monitoring my truck somehow? Are there other drivers receiving similar warnings?" Catherine's questions tumbled out in a rush, driven by her need to understand what had happened. "Catherine, there are forces at work in the transportation industry that extend beyond normal understanding. Experienced drivers who have spent their lives on America's highways sometimes find ways to continue protecting their fellow travelers even after their driving days have ended. Your safety matters to people you've never met, and your successful journey is important to the larger community of professional drivers." The explanation was cryptic and unsatisfying, but the caller's tone carried a warmth and sincerity that suggested genuine concern rather than deception or manipulation. Catherine had heard stories from other drivers about mysterious warnings and unexplained assistance, tales that were usually dismissed as folklore or coincidence. But her own experience suggested that there might be truth to some of those stories. Over the following months, Catherine received occasional communications from the same mysterious caller, always addressing her by her full name and always providing information that proved to be accurate and helpful. The caller warned her about developing weather conditions, advised her about traffic delays, and once directed her to a truck stop where she met another driver who needed assistance with a mechanical problem. The communications gradually became less frequent and eventually stopped entirely, but Catherine never forgot the experience of being watched over by someone who knew her identity, but remained forever anonymous. The incident had taught her that the trucking community extended beyond the visible network of drivers, dispatchers, and support personnel, to include protective forces that operated according to their own mysterious protocols. Catherine began paying closer attention to unusual radio communications and became more willing to assist other drivers who reported strange experiences or unexplained warnings. She started thinking of herself as part of a larger community that transcended the boundaries between the known and unknown, a network of mutual support that included both living drivers and whatever forces continued to watch over America's highways from beyond conventional understanding. Story 8. Channel that only responds when you're alone. The discovery of Channel 27's peculiar behavior happened gradually over the course of several months as Daniel began to notice a pattern in his late-night radio communications. As a long-haul trucker specializing in overnight deliveries, Daniel spent most of his driving time alone on empty highways, listening to the gentle hum of his diesel engine and the occasional chatter on the CB radio. His routes typically took him through remote areas where cellular coverage was spotty, and CB radio provided his primary connection to the outside world. Channel 27 had always been one of the quieter frequencies, used mainly for emergency communications and occasional conversations between drivers who wanted to avoid the busier channels. Daniel had monitored it periodically over the years, but it rarely carried much traffic. What he began to notice was that the channel seemed to come alive with activity only during his loneliest moments, when he was driving through the most isolated stretches of highway with no other traffic visible in either direction. The first clear example occurred on a Tuesday night in Montana, somewhere between Billings and Miles City, where the highway stretched across empty prairie for dozens of miles without a single light visible from the road. Daniel had been driving for 6 hours without seeing another commercial vehicle, and the isolation was beginning to affect his mood. He was feeling the familiar weight of loneliness that came with spending weeks at a time away from family and friends, traveling through a landscape that seemed infinite and empty. As he scanned through the radio channels looking for any signs of human activity, Channel 27 suddenly erupted with conversation. Multiple voices were discussing road conditions, sharing stories about their experiences, and engaging in the kind of casual chatter that made the long miles bearable. The conversations were detailed and engaging, covering topics that ranged from truck maintenance to family news to philosophical observations about life on the road. Daniel immediately joined the conversation, grateful for the human connection after hours of solitude. This is Daniel in the red Kenworth, eastbound on Highway 2. Good to hear some friendly voices out here tonight. It's been a quiet run so far. The response was immediate and welcoming, with several drivers acknowledging his transmission and inviting him to share his thoughts on the topics they were discussing. For the next 2 hours, Daniel participated in one of the most enjoyable CB conversations he had experienced in years. The other drivers were articulate, interesting, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him. They shared stories about their own experiences with isolation and loneliness, offered practical advice about managing the psychological challenges of long-haul driving, and created an atmosphere of mutual support and understanding. But when Daniel reached Miles City and stopped for fuel and food, the conversations on Channel 27 suddenly ceased. The frequency returned to its usual quiet state, with only occasional static and the distant whisper of far-off transmissions. Other drivers at the truck stop made no mention of having heard the lengthy conversations that had occupied the past 2 hours, and when Daniel tried to resume the discussions, he received no responses. Over the following weeks, Daniel began to pay closer attention to the pattern of activity on Channel 27. The channel remained quiet when he was driving in areas with moderate traffic or when he stopped at truck stops with other drivers. But whenever he found himself completely alone on remote highways, especially during the late-night hours when isolation felt most oppressive, the channel would come alive with exactly the kind of conversation he needed most. The phenomenon became more pronounced during particularly difficult periods in Daniel's personal life. When his father was diagnosed with cancer and Daniel was struggling with feelings of helplessness and fear, Channel 27 provided conversations about dealing with family health crises and managing stress during difficult times. When his relationship with his girlfriend ended and he was grappling with loneliness and regret, the channel offered discussions about maintaining emotional balance and finding meaning in solitary work. The conversations always seemed perfectly tailored to Daniel's emotional state and current circumstances. The other voices on the channel appeared to understand exactly what he was going through and provided the kind of support and perspective that he needed most. They never offered simplistic solutions or empty platitudes, but rather engaged in thoughtful discussions that helped him process his feelings and develop healthier approaches to the challenges he faced. What made the experience even more mysterious was the consistency and depth of the personalities he encountered on Channel 27. Daniel began to recognize individual voices and their characteristic ways of speaking, their particular areas of expertise, and their unique perspectives on life and work. There was an older driver named Frank who specialized in wisdom about managing long-term relationships while working on the road. A woman named Sarah shared insights about maintaining physical and mental health during extended periods of isolation. A younger driver named Mike offered perspectives on career development and finding purpose in professional truck driving. These personalities remained consistent across multiple conversations spanning months, with each voice maintaining its distinct character and building on previous discussions in ways that suggested genuine ongoing relationships. Frank would remember details from earlier conversations about Daniel's family situation. Sarah would follow up on health and fitness topics they had discussed weeks earlier. Mike would check on Daniel's progress toward professional goals they had talked about in previous sessions. The quality of the conversations was remarkable, far exceeding the typical level of CB radio chatter. The discussions were philosophical, emotionally intelligent, and demonstrated the kind of deep understanding of trucking culture and psychology that could only come from years of experience in the industry. The other voices shared insights about managing isolation, maintaining relationships, dealing with the physical demands of long-haul driving, and finding meaning in work that often felt disconnected from larger social purposes. Daniel began to look forward to his most isolated driving segments, knowing that Channel 27 would provide the intellectual and emotional stimulation he craved. The conversations became a vital part of his psychological well-being, offering a level of support and understanding that he had never found in his relationships with family, friends, or colleagues. The mysterious voices on the channel seemed to understand the unique challenges of his profession in ways that people outside the trucking industry simply couldn't. The phenomenon reached its peak during a particularly difficult winter run through Wyoming, when Daniel was driving through a blizzard that had closed most of the highway to regular traffic. He was completely alone on the road, fighting challenging weather conditions and dealing with the stress of maintaining schedule pressures despite the dangerous driving conditions. His isolation was complete, and his anxiety about the weather was affecting his ability to concentrate on driving safely. Channel 27 responded to his situation with the most supportive and helpful conversation he had ever experienced. The voices provided detailed advice about driving techniques for severe weather conditions, shared stories about their own experiences with similar challenges, and offered the kind of emotional support that helped him maintain his confidence and focus. The conversation continued throughout the night, with the mysterious voices providing exactly the kind of companionship he needed to get through the dangerous journey safely. But as Daniel's life circumstances began to improve, as he developed stronger relationships with family and friends, and found better ways to manage the isolation of his work, the conversations on Channel 27 became less frequent and less intense. The channel seemed to respond to his level of emotional need, providing support when he was most isolated, and gradually fading as he developed other sources of human connection. Eventually, Daniel realized that Channel 27 had been serving as a kind of psychological safety net, appearing when he needed it most and disappearing when he had found other ways to meet his social and emotional needs. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about managing isolation, maintaining mental health during long-haul driving, and recognizing the importance of human connection in his professional and personal life. Years later, when Daniel encountered other drivers who seemed to be struggling with loneliness and isolation, he would quietly suggest that they monitor Channel 27 during their most solitary moments. Some reported back with stories of meaningful conversations that had helped them through difficult times, while others heard nothing but static. Daniel came to believe that Channel 27 responded only to genuine need, providing its mysterious support to drivers who truly required the kind of understanding and companionship that existed nowhere else in their lives. Story 9. Distant music with lyrics predicting deaths. The music first reached Angela's radio during a foggy midnight run through the Appalachian Mountains, drifting through the static on an obscure AM frequency that she had never monitored before. She was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to Pennsylvania, navigating the winding mountain roads with the careful attention that such challenging terrain demanded. The fog was thick enough to reduce visibility to just a few dozen yards, and she had been driving in tense concentration for several hours. The melody that emerged from the radio static was hauntingly beautiful, performed by what sounded like a small folk ensemble with acoustic guitars, a violin, and a woman's voice that carried the kind of emotional depth that came from years of experience with both music and loss. The song had the timeless quality of traditional Appalachian folk music, but the lyrics were unlike anything Angela had heard before. There's a driver named Tommy who won't see the dawn. His rig will go sliding when the brake lights are gone. The curve by the river where the old oak tree bends, that's where Tommy's long journey finally ends. The words were sung with gentle melancholy, as if the singer was grieving for events that had not yet occurred, but were somehow inevitable. Angela found herself both captivated and disturbed by the mournful prediction. The song's melody was hypnotically beautiful, but the lyrics described a specific trucking accident with details that were unsettlingly precise. The mention of a curve by a river with an old oak tree sounded like it could describe dozens of locations throughout the mountain region, but the specificity of the driver's name and the nature of the accident made the song feel more like prophecy than entertainment. As the first song faded, another began with the same haunting musical arrangement, but different lyrics that described another driver's fate. Sarah drives northbound with a load of steel beams, but the bridge over Miller Creek ain't strong as it seems. When the thunder rolls heavy and the rain starts to fall, that's when Sarah and her cargo will tumble through it all. The songs continued throughout Angela's journey, each one describing a different truck driver's death with the same combination of specific detail and poetic melancholy. The musical quality was consistently excellent, with skilled instrumentation and vocals that conveyed genuine sorrow for the tragedies being described. But the content was deeply unsettling, painting a series of fatal accidents that seemed to span different times and locations throughout trucking history. What made the experience even more disturbing was the realization that some of the accidents described in the songs matched real events that Angela remembered from trucking news reports and industry safety bulletins. There had indeed been a driver named Tommy who had died in a brake failure accident near a river curve. Though the incident had occurred several years earlier, the bridge collapse that claimed Sarah and her load of steel beams had been a major news story in the trucking community just 6 months ago. The mysterious radio station seemed to be broadcasting musical memorials to truckers who had died in work accidents, but the songs described the accidents as if they were still in the future, rather than commemorating past events. Each ballad contained precise details about locations, circumstances, and outcomes that would have been impossible to predict without intimate knowledge of the actual incidents. As Angela continued listening over the following weeks, she began to recognize a pattern in the songs that was both fascinating and terrifying. The musical station appeared to be broadcasting prophecies of trucking accidents before they occurred, providing specific information about drivers, routes, and circumstances in the form of beautiful but mournful folk songs. The predictions were consistently accurate, with real accidents following the patterns described in the lyrics within days or weeks of the broadcasts. One particularly chilling song described an accident involving an ice storm and a driver named Marcus who would lose control on a steep grade in Colorado. Angela had met a driver named Marcus at a truck stop in Denver just a few days earlier, and she remembered that his next assignment was a mountain run that would take him through exactly the kind of terrain described in the song. The lyrics provided enough specific details about timing and location that Angela felt compelled to try to warn him. Finding Marcus proved challenging, as Angela had only his first name and a general description of his truck. But the urgency she felt about the prophetic song drove her to spend hours trying to track him down through CB radio networks and truck stop contacts. She finally located him 2 days later, just as he was preparing to begin the mountain run that the song had described. "Marcus, this is going to sound strange, but I heard something that suggests you might want to postpone your Colorado run until the weather clears," Angela said when she finally made contact with him on the radio. "There's supposed to be a bad ice storm moving through the area, and the conditions might be more dangerous than the forecast indicates." Marcus was initially skeptical of the warning from a driver he barely knew, but Angela's obvious sincerity and specific knowledge of his route convinced him to check the latest weather reports more carefully. What he found was a developing storm system that was indeed more severe than originally forecast, with conditions that would create exactly the kind of dangerous ice situation that the prophetic song had described. Marcus decided to delay his departure by 2 days, allowing the storm system to pass and road conditions to improve. During the period when he would have been making the hazardous mountain crossing, several accidents occurred on that exact route due to unexpected ice formation, including one fatal incident involving a driver who lost control on a steep grade, under circumstances that matched the song's predictions perfectly. The experience convinced Angela that the mysterious radio station was somehow broadcasting genuine warnings about future trucking accidents, using the format of folk songs to communicate information that could save lives. She began listening to the station regularly not for entertainment, but as a source of early warning about developing dangers in the trucking community. Over time, Angela developed a system for interpreting the prophetic songs and attempting to warn drivers when the lyrics contained enough specific information to identify potential victims. She created a network of contacts throughout the trucking community who helped her locate drivers mentioned in the songs and pass along warnings about hazardous conditions or dangerous routes. Not every attempt was successful, but she managed to prevent several accidents by convincing drivers to modify their routes or delay their trips based on the musical prophecies. The station's programming seemed to operate according to its own mysterious schedule, sometimes broadcasting multiple songs in a single night, and sometimes remaining silent for weeks at a time. Angela never found any official listing for the frequency or any information about who might be operating the station. The signal strength varied unpredictably, sometimes coming through with crystal clarity and other times barely audible through heavy static. What remained consistent was the quality of the music and the accuracy of the predictions. The folk ensemble that performed the songs demonstrated remarkable musical skill and emotional sensitivity, treating each prophetic ballad as a genuine memorial to a driver who had not yet died, but whose fate seemed already determined. The lyrics showed intimate knowledge of trucking culture, specific routes, and the kinds of mechanical failures and weather conditions that pose the greatest risks to professional drivers. Angela began to think of the mysterious radio station as a kind of guardian angel for the trucking community, using music to communicate warnings that might otherwise go unheeded. The folk song format made the predictions memorable and emotionally resonant in ways that conventional safety warnings could never achieve. The haunting melodies stayed in listeners' minds, ensuring that the safety information would be remembered when it might be needed most. The station's influence on Angela's life extended beyond her role as an unofficial safety coordinator. The beautiful, melancholy music provided a soundtrack for her long nights on empty highways, and the song's themes of fate, loss, and community solidarity gave her a deeper appreciation for the bonds that connected professional drivers across the vast network of American highways. She began to see her work not just as a job, but as part of a larger tradition of people who risked their lives to keep the country's commerce flowing. Years later, Angela would still scan the AM frequencies during quiet nights, hoping to hear the mysterious folk station and its prophetic songs. The music had become a vital part of her understanding of trucking culture and her commitment to driver safety. Whether the station represented some kind of supernatural phenomenon or simply an unusually well-informed and musically gifted group of people, Angela knew that it had made her a better and more safety-conscious driver and had probably saved lives through the warning she had been able to pass along to other members of the trucking community. Story 10. Transmission from your own voice, older. The transmission came through on Channel 15 during Robert's routine haul from Chicago to Memphis, and the voice that emerged from his CB radio speakers was unmistakably his own, but aged by what sounded like 20 or 30 years. The tone was deeper, rougher around the edges from decades of wear, and carried the weight of experience that comes only with time. But the speech patterns, the particular way of emphasizing certain words, and the slight Midwestern accent were all perfectly familiar, because Robert heard them in his own voice every day. "Robert, this is your future calling," the aged version of his voice said with a mixture of warmth and urgency. "I need to share some things with you that will save you years of mistakes and help you make better choices, while you still have time to change course." Robert nearly swerved off the interstate in shock. The voice was definitely his own, but speaking with a kind of wisdom and authority that suggested decades of additional life experience. His first instinct was to assume someone was playing an elaborate prank, using voice synthesis technology to create a convincing imitation of his speech. But the quality was too perfect, capturing subtle inflections and vocal characteristics that would be nearly impossible to replicate artificially. "This is some kind of joke, right?" Robert responded, trying to keep his voice steady while grappling with the impossible nature of what he was hearing. Who is this really, and how did you get recordings of my voice to manipulate like this?" The response came with patient understanding, as if the older voice had been expecting skepticism. "I know this is hard to believe, Robert, because I remember having the same conversation from your perspective 32 years ago. I was driving the same route, hauling the same kind of freight, and I was just as confused and frightened as you are right now. But I need you to listen carefully, because the decisions you make in the next few years will determine whether you end up happy and successful or filled with regret." The older Robert began sharing specific details about the younger man's life that no prankster could have known. He knew about Robert's secret plan to quit trucking and open a small auto repair shop, a dream that Robert had never shared with anyone. He knew about Robert's complicated relationship with his father, including specific conversations and unresolved conflicts that were deeply personal. He even knew about Robert's habit of listening to jazz music during long drives, a preference that Robert had never mentioned to other drivers. "The repair shop idea isn't going to work out the way you're planning," the older voice continued. "The location you're considering has foundation problems that won't become apparent until after you sign the lease. The partner you're thinking about bringing in will embezzle money and disappear 6 months after you open. And the market for independent auto repair is going to change dramatically over the next decade in ways that will make your business model obsolete." The specificity of the warnings was unsettling, but what struck Robert most was the genuine concern in the older voice. This wasn't someone trying to scare him or manipulate him for malicious purposes. The aged version of his voice spoke with the kind of loving authority that a father might use when trying to protect his son from making serious mistakes. "So what should I do instead?" Robert asked, beginning to consider the possibility that he might actually be talking to some version of his future self. "If the repair shop is a bad idea, what direction should I take my career?" "Stay in trucking for now, but start specializing in hazardous materials transport," the older Robert advised. "It requires additional training and certification, but the pay is significantly better and the work is more interesting. More importantly, you'll meet a woman named Patricia at a hazmat training course in Kansas City 2 years from now. She'll become your business partner first, then your wife, and eventually the mother of your 3 children." The prediction about meeting his future wife was both thrilling and disturbing. Robert was currently single and hadn't had a serious relationship in over 2 years. The idea that his future self knew exactly when and where he would meet the woman he would marry suggested a level of predetermination that challenged his beliefs about free will and personal choice. "What else can you tell me about the future?" Robert asked, curiosity overcoming his skepticism. "What should I be preparing for? What mistakes should I avoid?" The older voice shared a wealth of practical advice, based on decades of experience. He warned Robert about specific investment opportunities that would turn out to be scams, advised him to maintain better relationships with his siblings before family conflicts became irreparable, and encouraged him to take better care of his health before chronic problems developed. The guidance was always specific and actionable, with clear explanations of why certain choices would lead to better outcomes. "Your knees are going to start giving you problems in about 8 years if you don't start doing flexibility exercises now," the older Robert said. "And that cough you've been ignoring isn't just from diesel fumes. You need to see a doctor within the next 6 months to catch a health issue before it becomes serious." The health warning was particularly disturbing because Robert had indeed been experiencing a persistent cough that he had been attributing to occupational exposure to diesel emissions. The older voice's insistence that medical attention was urgently needed made him realize that he might have been dangerously negligent about his physical well-being. Over the following months, Robert found himself following much of the advice that his older self had provided. He scheduled the recommended medical examination and discovered early-stage lung problems that required immediate treatment but were completely curable when addressed promptly. He began the hazardous materials training program and found that he enjoyed both the technical challenges and the increased earning potential. He also started the flexibility exercises and noticed improvements in his overall physical condition. The periodic conversations with his older self continued for nearly 2 years, always occurring during long, solitary drives when Robert was feeling uncertain about major life decisions. The aged version of his voice provided guidance that was consistently helpful, steering him away from poor choices and toward opportunities that aligned with his long-term interests and capability. The relationship reached its culmination when Robert attended the hazardous materials training course in Kansas City and met Patricia exactly as his older self had predicted. She was intelligent, funny, shared his interest in trucking, and possessed the kind of practical business sense that complemented his mechanical skills perfectly. Their partnership developed naturally from professional collaboration to personal relationship, following the timeline that the older Robert had described. As Robert's life began aligning with the predictions his future self had made, the communications gradually became less frequent. The older voice seemed satisfied that the younger Robert was making better choices and no longer needed as much guidance. The final transmission came on the second anniversary of the first contact, with the aged Robert expressing pride in how well the younger man had implemented the advice he had received. "You've done well, Robert," the older voice said, with obvious satisfaction. "You've avoided the mistakes that haunted my version of your life, and you're on a path toward happiness and success that I never achieved. The future you're creating will be better than the past I lived, and that's exactly what I hope to accomplish through these conversations." Robert never heard from his older self again, but the impact of those communications continued to influence his decisions for years to come. He and Patricia built a successful hazmat transport business, raised 3 children, and maintained the kind of strong family relationships that his future self had emphasized as being crucial for long-term happiness. The mysterious ability to communicate with his older self had given Robert the wisdom to make better choices while he still had time to benefit from them. Story 11. Radio Countdown Your Miles to Death. The countdown began at mile 847, displayed on a digital readout that appeared on Jerry's CB radio at exactly midnight during a routine freight run from Dallas to Denver. The radio had never shown numerical displays before. It was a basic analog model that had been in service for over a decade, but suddenly the green digits glowed ominously on the dark face of the device. 847 miles remaining. Jerry initially assumed the display was some kind of malfunction, perhaps a crossed wire that was causing his odometer reading to appear on the radio somehow. His trip computer showed that he had indeed traveled 847 miles since leaving Dallas, so the number wasn't random. But as he continued driving through the Texas night, he noticed that the display was counting down rather than up, decreasing by 1 with each mile he traveled. 846 miles remaining, 845 miles remaining, 844 miles remaining. The steady countdown continued throughout the night, and Jerry began to feel increasingly uneasy about what it might represent. The most logical explanation was still some kind of technical glitch, but the precision of the counting and the ominous phrasing of miles remaining suggested something more sinister than a simple equipment malfunction. By the time he reached the New Mexico border, the counter had reached 723 miles remaining, and Jerry decided to pull over at a truck stop to examine his radio more carefully. Under the bright lights of the parking area, he could see that the digital display was not coming from any normal component of his CB radio. The green numbers appeared to be projected from inside the device, with no visible source or connection to the truck's electrical system. Jerry tried turning the radio off and on, checking all the connections and even disconnecting the power supply completely, but the countdown continued regardless of the radio's apparent operating status, as if the display was being powered by some independent source that had nothing to do with his truck's electrical system. "Base station, this is Jerry in the white Peterbilt at the Flying J in Tucumcari," he called on Channel 19. hoping that other drivers might have experienced similar phenomena. Anyone ever seen anything like a countdown display on their CB radio? Digital numbers that keep decreasing with the miles? The responses he received were varied but unhelpful. Some drivers suggested technical explanations involving crossed signals from GPS systems or mobile phones. Others recommended taking the radio to an electronics repair shop. A few mentioned having seen unusual displays during electrical storms or when passing near radio transmission towers. But none had experienced anything exactly like the persistent countdown that was now showing 704 miles remaining. As Jerry resumed his journey, the countdown became an obsession that dominated his thoughts. He found himself calculating what would happen when the numbers reached zero, wondering whether the prediction referred to his arrival at his destination, some kind of equipment failure, or something far more ominous. The phrase, "miles remaining," had an unmistakably final quality that suggested countdown to an ending rather than arrival at a goal. The mathematics were troubling. Jerry's destination in Denver was approximately 520 miles from his current location, which meant the countdown would reach zero somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, well past his scheduled delivery point. If the numbers represented some kind of prediction about his remaining lifespan, measured in driving miles, he had fewer than 700 miles left to live. The possibility that the countdown represented a prediction of his death became more disturbing as Jerry considered the inherent dangers of his route through the Colorado mountains. The highway involved steep grades, sharp curves, unpredictable weather conditions, and the kind of challenging driving that had claimed many truckers' lives over the years. If something was predicting his death by mile count rather than time, the dangerous mountain terrain would be a logical location for a fatal accident. Despite his growing anxiety, Jerry continued driving according to his normal schedule. The countdown provided a hypnotic focus for his attention, and he found himself checking the display obsessively as the miles decreased. 650 miles remaining, 600 miles remaining, 550 miles remaining. Each number brought him closer to whatever fate the countdown was predicting. The experience became even more surreal when Jerry realized that the countdown seemed to be affecting his driving behavior. He found himself driving more cautiously, taking extra time to inspect his truck at rest stops, and avoiding the kind of calculated risks that experienced drivers normally accepted as part of the job. The psychological pressure of knowing that his remaining miles were decreasing created a level of hypervigilance that was both exhausting and potentially dangerous. As he climbed into the Colorado mountains with 487 miles remaining on the countdown, Jerry began encountering other drivers who seemed to be experiencing similar phenomena. A woman named Lisa contacted him on Channel 19 to report that her GPS system was displaying strange messages about final destination approaching, and her estimated arrival time kept changing to show dates that were years in the future. "It's like all our electronic equipment is predicting something that hasn't happened yet," Lisa said during their radio conversation. "My truck computer is showing engine failure warnings for components that are working perfectly, and my fuel gauge is reading empty even though I just filled up." Jerry shared his own experience with the countdown display, and soon other drivers began reporting their own encounters with predictive electronic malfunctions. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Multiple truckers were receiving what appeared to be warnings or predictions about fatal accidents, equipment failures, or other disasters that were supposedly approaching based on mile markers or time intervals. The collective nature of the phenomenon suggested that something larger was happening than individual equipment malfunctions. Jerry began to wonder whether some unknown force was trying to warn truckers about impending dangers, using their own electronic systems to communicate information about threats that conventional safety monitoring couldn't detect. The countdown reached 423 miles remaining as Jerry descended a particularly challenging mountain grade in heavy fog. Visibility was limited to just a few dozen feet, and he was driving with extreme caution when his headlights suddenly illuminated the wreckage of a major accident that had apparently occurred just minutes earlier. Multiple vehicles were scattered across the highway, including a jackknifed semi that completely blocked both lanes of traffic. Jerry managed to stop safely, but he realized that if he had been driving at his normal speed, or if he had arrived just a few minutes earlier, he would have been unable to avoid the accident and would likely have become part of the wreckage himself. The countdown display seemed to have influenced his driving behavior in ways that had ultimately saved his life. Emergency vehicles arrived within an hour, and Jerry learned that the accident had been caused by a sudden weather change that created ice patches on the roadway. 3 trucks had been involved in the initial collision, and several other vehicles had crashed while trying to avoid the wreckage. If Jerry had maintained his normal driving schedule and speed, he would have been in exactly the right place at the right time to become a casualty of the multi-vehicle accident. The countdown display continued to decrease as traffic was cleared, and Jerry resumed his journey, but his perspective on its meaning had changed completely. Rather than predicting his death, the mysterious countdown seemed to be helping him avoid it by influencing his behavior in subtle ways that kept him out of danger. The remaining miles weren't counting down to his death, but rather measuring the distance he needed to travel while maintaining heightened caution to avoid predetermined hazards. When Jerry finally reached Denver and completed his delivery, the countdown display showed 97 miles remaining. He realized that the mysterious system had been calibrated not to his destination, but to some other significant location that was still nearly 100 miles away. Rather than continuing to wonder about the countdown's ultimate meaning, Jerry decided to trust that whatever force was protecting him through the display would continue to do so as long as he remained alert to the warnings it provided. The countdown never reached 0, but it continued to influence Jerry's driving behavior for years to come. He became one of the safest drivers in his company, avoiding accidents and equipment failures through a combination of cautious driving and careful attention to the subtle warnings that his modified CB radio continued to provide. The mysterious display had transformed from a source of anxiety into a guardian angel that helped him navigate the dangerous highways with supernatural protection. Story 12. Channel that connects to another dimension. The phenomenon began when truck driver Maria accidentally tuned her CB radio to a frequency that didn't officially exist. She was scanning through channels during a boring stretch of interstate through Kansas, looking for interesting conversations to help pass the time, when she discovered what seemed to be Channel 41. According to her radio's specifications, the device only covered channels 1 through 40, but the dial clearly indicated 41, and the reception was crystal clear. The first voice she heard on the mysterious channel was discussing weather conditions, but the locations mentioned were unfamiliar, despite sounding like they should be recognizable. Traffic on Interstate 72 is backing up due to the meteor shower debris from last night, reported a professional-sounding dispatcher. Drivers approaching the Chicago-Detroit corridor should expect delays while cleanup crews clear the crystalline fragments from the roadway. Maria checked her atlas and GPS system. There was no Interstate 72 in the Chicago-Detroit area, and she hadn't heard any news reports about meteor shower debris causing traffic problems. Yet the dispatcher's voice sounded completely legitimate, using proper radio protocols and speaking with the authority of someone who genuinely believed in the information being shared. As she continued listening, more voices joined the channel with reports that became increasingly strange. Drivers were discussing fuel stops that served plasma-based energy cells alongside traditional diesel. Load manifests included cargo types like temporal stabilization equipment and dimensional interface components. Route discussions mentioned highways with numbers that didn't correspond to any roads in Maria's reality. This is eastbound driver Carlos on I-95 approaching the Boston Teleportation Hub, came one transmission. Requesting permission to use the express portal for my delivery to the Mars Colony Supply Depot. My cargo of atmospheric processors is running behind schedule due to solar storm interference. The conversations were detailed and consistent, suggesting a complete alternate reality where trucking had evolved to include interplanetary routes, exotic fuel types, and technologies that didn't exist in Maria's world. The drivers spoke with the same casual familiarity about teleportation hubs and Mars colonies that Maria's colleagues used when discussing truck stops and warehouse facilities. What made the experience even more surreal was that the alternate dimension drivers seemed to be aware of her presence on their frequency. When Maria tentatively keyed her microphone to ask questions, they responded as if her version of reality was the alternate one that required explanation. "You're from the dimension where humans are still confined to Earth transportation?" asked a driver who identified herself as Sandra. "We've heard about that reality stream. Your trucking industry must be incredibly primitive if you're still using petroleum-based fuels and limiting routes to a single planet." Sandra explained that in her dimension, human civilization had developed faster than different decades earlier, leading to an expansion of commerce that included regular freight runs to Mars, Venus, and several space stations throughout the solar system. The trucking industry had adapted to include spacecraft capable of both terrestrial highways and interplanetary routes. "The basic principles are the same," Sandra continued. "We still deal with delivery schedules, difficult customers, and equipment maintenance. But our rest stops serve multiple species now, and our cargo manifests can include everything from Earth vegetables to Martian minerals to exotic matter from the outer colonies." Maria found herself spending hours listening to descriptions of this alternate trucking reality. The dimensional differences were fascinating but also strangely familiar. The alternate dimension drivers dealt with the same kinds of professional challenges that Maria faced: demanding schedules, difficult customers, mechanical problems, and the social isolation that came with long-distance transportation work. The parallel truckers shared stories about their most interesting hauls, which included transporting rare elements from asteroid mining operations, delivering livestock to lunar agricultural stations, and hauling construction materials for projects on the moons of Jupiter. Their rest stops included facilities where drivers from different planets could socialize and share information about route conditions throughout the solar system. "Last week, I had to deliver a load of Earth coffee to a research station near Saturn," reported a driver named Miguel. "The scientists there had been drinking synthetic caffeine substitutes for 6 months and were desperate for the real thing. The gratitude bonus they paid made the long haul worth all the trouble with the radiation shielding requirements." The alternate dimension truckers also faced unique challenges that didn't exist in Maria's reality. Solar storms could disrupt navigation systems and make certain routes temporarily impassable. Alien customs officials at some destinations required complex documentation and bribes. Mechanical problems in deep space could be life-threatening rather than merely inconvenient. But what struck Maria most was how similar the fundamental human elements remained despite the exotic technological context. The alternate dimension drivers still struggled with loneliness during long hauls, still worried about their families back home, and still found satisfaction in successfully completing challenging deliveries. The scale and scope of their work had expanded to include the entire solar system, but the core experience of professional trucking remained recognizably human. Over several months, Maria developed ongoing relationships with several drivers from the alternate dimension. She shared stories about her own trucking experiences, and they provided perspectives on how their industry had evolved to accommodate interplanetary commerce. The conversations became a regular part of her driving routine, offering both entertainment and insights into alternate approaches to the challenges she faced in her own work. The interdimensional truckers also seemed to learn from Maria's descriptions of terrestrial-only transportation. They were fascinated by her stories about diverse regional cultures within a single planet, varied weather conditions that changed with geographic location rather than solar radiation patterns, and the kinds of natural disasters that were unique to planetary surface transportation. "Your dimension has something we lost when we expanded beyond Earth," observed Sandra during one of their regular conversations. "You still have the kind of intimate connection to specific places and local communities that gets diluted when your roots span multiple worlds. There's something appealing about knowing the personality of every truck stop and the history of every highway." The alternate dimension channel provided Maria with a unique perspective on her own career and life choices. Hearing about the vast scope of interplanetary trucking made her appreciate the manageable scale of terrestrial transportation, while the familiar human elements in the exotic stories reminded her of the universal aspects of her profession that transcended any particular technological context. Eventually, Maria began losing the ability to tune in to Channel 41, as if the dimensional connection was gradually weakening. Her final conversations with the alternate reality truckers focused on the lessons they had shared with each other and the appreciation they had gained for their respective versions of the trucking profession. Remember that every dimension of reality includes drivers who are working to keep commerce flowing and communities connected, Sandra said during their last clear communication. Whether you're hauling freight across a continent or across the galaxy, you're part of something larger that binds civilizations together through the practical work of transportation. The interdimensional channel disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving Maria with a broader perspective on her place in the universe and a deeper appreciation for the essential role that professional drivers played in maintaining the connections that kept societies functioning, regardless of the scale or scope of their transportation networks. Story 13. CB Radio Controlled by Unseen Hands. The first incident occurred during a routine delivery run from Seattle to San Francisco when Gary's CB radio began operating independently while he was stopped at a rest area near the Oregon-California border. He had parked his truck and gone into the facility to use the restroom and grab a cup of coffee, leaving the radio turned on but with the volume lowered. When he returned to his cab 15 minutes later, he could hear his own voice transmitting over channel 19, but he was not speaking and the microphone was hanging in its normal position on the dashboard. "This is the blue Freightliner southbound on I-5, his voice was saying through the speakers. "Just wanted to report that road conditions are excellent through the Oregon mountains, and the weather is holding clear all the way to the California border. Safe travels to all drivers in the area tonight." Gary stood frozen beside his truck, listening to his own voice broadcast information he hadn't consciously decided to share. The transmission was perfectly normal in content, the kind of helpful road condition report that drivers regularly shared with each other. But Gary hadn't keyed the microphone, hadn't decided to broadcast anything, and was standing outside his truck, listening to himself communicate with other drivers without his conscious participation. He climbed back into his cab and examined the radio equipment carefully. The microphone was in its normal position, not activated or stuck in transmit mode. The radio dials were set exactly as he had left them, with no indication that anyone had been operating the equipment. Yet his voice had been broadcasting clear, coherent messages that other drivers on the frequency were acknowledging and responding to. "Thanks for the road report, Blue Freightliner," came a response from another driver. "Conditions here in Northern California are looking good too. Appreciate the update." Gary keyed his microphone to respond, but found himself speaking words he hadn't planned to say. "Glad to help out," his voice said automatically. "We all need to look out for each other on these long runs. Drive safe, brother." The words were appropriate and sincere, expressing sentiments that Gary genuinely felt, but he hadn't consciously chosen to speak them. It was as if some external force was operating his vocal cords and radio equipment, using his voice to communicate thoughts that aligned with his beliefs but weren't under his direct control. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon became more frequent and more sophisticated. Gary's radio would engage in complex conversations with other drivers, sharing detailed information about route conditions, truck stops, mechanical problems, and the general experiences of long-haul trucking. The conversations were always helpful and appropriate, demonstrating extensive knowledge of the trucking industry and genuine concern for driver safety and well-being. What was most disturbing was that the unseen force controlling his radio seemed to know things that Gary didn't. His voice would provide accurate information about road construction, weather conditions, and traffic problems in areas he hadn't visited recently. The invisible operator of his equipment had access to current, detailed knowledge about trucking conditions throughout the western United States. Information that Gary couldn't have possessed through his own experience or research. "This is Gary in the blue Freightliner, eastbound on I-80, his voice announced during one particularly striking example. "Heads up to drivers approaching the Donner Pass area. There's a disabled vehicle blocking the right lane at mile marker 156, and tow trucks haven't arrived yet. Slow down and be prepared to merge left." Gary was indeed traveling eastbound on I-80, but he was still more than 100 miles from Donner Pass and had no way of knowing about traffic conditions in that area. Yet when he reached mile marker 156 several hours later, he found exactly the situation his voice had described: a disabled vehicle blocking the right lane, with tow trucks just arriving to clear the obstruction. The invisible controller of Gary's radio demonstrated not only knowledge of current conditions, but also apparent concern for his personal well-being. During one difficult stretch of mountain driving in hazardous weather, his voice began broadcasting requests for assistance and companionship that Gary hadn't consciously decided to make. "Any drivers in the I-84 corridor near Baker City? This is Gary in the blue Freightliner," his voice called out during a particularly challenging snowstorm. "Could use some company through this weather if anyone's heading east. Visibility's getting pretty rough, and it would be nice to have someone to talk to through the worst of it." Within minutes, 2 other drivers responded to the request, and Gary found himself part of an informal convoy that helped all 3 trucks navigate safely through dangerous conditions. The conversation his radio engaged in was natural and helpful, creating exactly the kind of mutual support network that experienced drivers used to handle challenging situations. Gary began to realize that the unseen force controlling his radio was acting as a kind of guardian angel, using his voice and equipment to create beneficial connections and provide helpful information to the trucking community. The entity seemed to understand both his personal needs and the broader requirements of safe, efficient transportation, intervening only when its assistance would genuinely improve conditions for Gary or other drivers. The phenomenon reached its peak during a medical emergency that occurred while Gary was driving through a remote area of Nevada. He began experiencing chest pains that made him worry about a possible heart attack, but he was more than 50 miles from the nearest hospital and uncertain about how to get help quickly. Before Gary could consciously decide how to handle the situation, his radio began broadcasting a detailed medical emergency report. "Mayday! Mayday, this is Gary in the blue Freightliner, mile marker 127 on Highway 6 in Nevada. I'm experiencing severe chest pains and need immediate medical assistance, requesting guidance to nearest hospital and ambulance dispatched to my location." The transmission included precise location information, detailed symptoms, and appropriate emergency protocols that Gary wouldn't have remembered under the stress of a potential cardiac event. Within minutes, other drivers were responding with directions to the nearest medical facility, and emergency services were being dispatched to intercept Gary's truck and provide immediate assistance. The medical emergency turned out to be severe gastric distress rather than a heart attack, but the rapid response, coordinated by his radio's invisible controller, had ensured that Gary received proper medical evaluation and treatment. The entity operating his equipment had recognized the seriousness of his symptoms and had initiated the appropriate emergency response procedures more quickly and effectively than Gary could have managed himself. After the medical incident, Gary developed a different relationship with the mysterious force that controlled his radio. Instead of feeling invaded or manipulated, he began to appreciate the protective presence that seemed to be watching over him and using his equipment to provide assistance to the broader trucking community. The entity never seemed to have malicious intentions or personal agenda beyond ensuring safety and facilitating helpful communication. Over time, Gary learned to cooperate with the invisible controller rather than fighting against it. When his radio began engaging in conversations or broadcasting information, he would listen carefully and often learn valuable details about road conditions or safety issues that he would have missed otherwise. The entity's use of his voice became a collaborative effort that enhanced his effectiveness as a professional driver. The phenomenon gradually became less frequent as Gary developed better skills for recognizing and responding to the kinds of situations where the invisible controller had previously intervened. It was as if the entity had been teaching him to be a more aware and helpful member of the trucking community, and as his capabilities improved, the need for external assistance diminished. Eventually, Gary's radio returned to normal operation, but he retained the lessons he had learned from his collaboration with the mysterious entity. He became more attentive to opportunities to help other drivers, more skilled at recognizing dangerous conditions before they became critical, and more effective at using his radio equipment to maintain the kind of mutual support networks that kept professional drivers safe on America's highways. Story 14. Messages carved into truck interior overnight. The first message appeared on a Tuesday morning when Leonard conducted his routine pre-trip inspection before beginning a haul from Phoenix to Portland. Carved into the dashboard of his 2018 Kenworth just below the radio were words that definitely hadn't been there the night before. Check your brake lines before you reach the mountain pass. Leonard ran his fingers over the carved letters, feeling the fresh wood shavings that indicated recent work. The message was cut deep into the dashboard, requiring considerable time and effort to complete. Yet Leonard had been sleeping in his cab all night and hadn't heard any sounds that would suggest someone working inside his truck. The cab doors had been locked, the windows were closed, and there was no evidence that anyone had broken into the vehicle. More troubling than the mysterious appearance of the carved message was its content. Leonard was indeed scheduled to drive through mountain passes in Oregon, and brake system integrity was always a critical safety concern on steep grades. The message seemed to be providing a genuine safety warning, but its supernatural method of delivery made it difficult to take seriously. Despite his skepticism, Leonard decided to inspect his brake system more thoroughly than usual. During his detailed examination, he discovered a small crack in one of the brake lines that could have caused system failure under the stress of prolonged mountain driving. The crack was so subtle that it would have been missed during a normal inspection, but it represented a serious safety hazard that could have led to a catastrophic accident. Leonard had the brake line replaced immediately, delaying his departure by several hours but potentially saving his life. As he finally began his journey toward Oregon, he couldn't stop thinking about the carved message and wondering how it had appeared in his truck overnight. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, and the safety warning had been genuinely helpful. The second message appeared 3 weeks later, carved into the wooden trim around his sleeper compartment. Maria needs help at the Tucson truck stop. Blue trailer, broken down in the back row. Leonard was currently driving through Arizona, and the Tucson truck stop mentioned in the message was directly on his planned route. The carving looked fresh, with the same deep lettering and wood shavings that had characterized the first message. When Leonard reached the Tucson truck stop that evening, he found exactly what the carved message had described. A female driver named Maria was stranded in the back parking area with a blue trailer, dealing with a mechanical breakdown that had left her without transportation or communication with her dispatcher. She had been waiting for hours for assistance, growing increasingly worried about making her delivery schedule. "How did you know I needed help?" Maria asked when Leonard approached and offered to assist with her mechanical problem. "I haven't been able to reach anyone on the radio, and my cell phone doesn't have service in this area." Leonard couldn't explain how he had known about her situation without sounding like he was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. Instead, he simply said that he had heard about her problem through the driver network, and offered to help with repairs or to contact her dispatcher using his satellite communication system. The assistance provided to Maria was genuinely needed and deeply appreciated, but Leonard remained disturbed by the supernatural method through which he had learned about her situation. The carved messages were appearing overnight in his locked truck, providing information that was accurate and helpful, but impossible to explain through normal means. Over the following months, more messages appeared with increasing frequency. Each was carved into a different part of his truck's interior using the same deep lettering style and appearing overnight, without any indication of how the work was being accomplished. The messages covered a wide range of topics, from safety warnings to suggestions about. Over the following months, more messages appeared with increasing frequency. Each was carved into a different part of his truck's interior, using the same deep lettering style and appearing overnight without any indication of how the work was being accomplished. The messages covered a wide range of topics, from safety warnings to suggestions about route optimization to personal advice about Leonard's relationships and career decisions. Take the northern route through Colorado, read one message carved into his steering wheel. The southern highway will be closed tomorrow due to rock slide. Leonard had been planning to take the southern route, which was shorter and normally more efficient, but the carved warning convinced him to modify his plans. The following day, he learned that a major rock slide had, indeed, closed the southern highway exactly as the message had predicted. "Call your sister before it's too late," appeared carved into the doorframe of his sleeper compartment. Leonard hadn't spoken to his sister in over 2 years, due to a family dispute that had grown more bitter with time. The message reminded him that their relationship was more important than the petty arguments that had driven them apart. When he finally called her, he learned that she had been diagnosed with a serious illness and was scheduled for major surgery the following week. The carved messages seemed to have access to information about Leonard's personal life that was both intimate and prophetic. They warned him about health issues before symptoms appeared, advised him about financial decisions that proved to be wise, and encouraged him to maintain relationships that became increasingly important as time passed. "The mechanic in Denver is overcharging you," read a message carved into his dashboard. "Use Rodriguez Auto Service on Colfax instead." Leonard had been planning to take his truck to a repair shop in Denver that he had used several times before, but the carved recommendation led him to try a different facility. Rodriguez Auto Service not only provided better work at lower prices, but also discovered additional problems that the original shop had been ignoring or deliberately concealing. The mysterious messages began to feel less like supernatural intrusions and more like guidance from a benevolent mentor who had intimate knowledge of Leonard's life and circumstances. The advice was consistently helpful, the warnings were always accurate, and the overall tone was supportive rather than threatening or manipulative. Leonard began leaving notebooks and pens in his cab, hoping that whoever was carving the messages might prefer to communicate through less destructive means. But the entity responsible for the guidance seemed to prefer the permanent, emphatic nature of carved wood, continuing to create new messages in various parts of his truck's interior. "You're going to meet someone important at the truck stop in Amarillo," appeared carved into his gear shifter handle. "Don't be afraid to start a conversation." Leonard was naturally shy and rarely initiated social interactions with strangers, but the carved message encouraged him to be more open when he reached Amarillo. At the Amarillo truck stop, Leonard struck up a conversation with another driver named Frank, who turned out to be recruiting experienced drivers for a small company that offered better pay, more flexible schedules, and more interesting routes than Leonard's current employer. The conversation led to a job opportunity that significantly improved Leonard's career prospects and personal satisfaction with his work. The carved messages had somehow known that this important meeting would occur, and had encouraged Leonard to overcome his natural reticence to take advantage of the opportunity. The guidance demonstrated not only knowledge of future events, but also understanding of Leonard's personality traits and the kinds of encouragement he needed to reach his potential. As Leonard's life improved through following the advice contained in the carved messages, he began to develop theories about their source. The entity providing the guidance seemed to know him intimately and care deeply about his welfare. The advice covered both practical trucking concerns and personal life issues, suggesting someone who understood both his professional challenges and his individual psychology. Leonard began to suspect that the mysterious guidance might be coming from his late father, who had been a truck driver for 35 years before his death 5 years earlier. His father had always been protective and supportive, offering practical advice mixed with personal encouragement. The tone and content of the carved messages seemed consistent with his father's approach to helping Leonard navigate life's challenges. "Dad, is that you?" Leonard wrote in one of the notebooks he left in his cab, hoping for some kind of confirmation of his theory about the message's source. The next morning, he found a new message carved into his sun visor. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you're becoming the man you were meant to be." The response neither confirmed nor denied Leonard's suspicion about his father's involvement, but it emphasized the entity's focus on Leonard's personal growth and success rather than its own identity. The mysterious guidance continued for several more years, always appearing as carved messages in Leonard's truck interior, always providing helpful and accurate advice. Eventually, the messages became less frequent and finally stopped appearing altogether. Leonard's life had stabilized considerably under the influence of the supernatural guidance, and he had developed better decision-making skills and more confidence in his ability to handle challenges independently. The entity that had been watching over him seemed satisfied that its assistance was no longer needed. Leonard kept his truck for many years after the carved messages stopped appearing, preserving the wooden interior with its accumulated collection of guidance and wisdom. The carved words served as permanent reminders of the mysterious protection he had received and the importance of remaining open to help from unexpected sources. Story 15, Dispatcher Voice That Imitates Your Family. The voice of Rachel's mother came through the CB radio during a lonely midnight run through Montana, speaking with the same gentle authority that had guided Rachel through childhood and adolescence. "Honey, you need to stop driving and get some rest," the familiar voice said with maternal concern. "You've been on the road for 14 hours straight, and you're starting to make mistakes that could get you hurt." Rachel's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she recognized the distinctive speech patterns, vocal inflections, and caring tone that belonged unmistakably to her mother, who had been dead for 3 years. The voice was coming through on Channel 9, the emergency frequency, with crystal clear reception that suggested a nearby transmission source. But Rachel was alone on a remote stretch of highway with no other traffic visible in either direction. "Mom," Rachel whispered, hardly daring to hope that some impossible communication had been established with her deceased parent. "Is that really you?" The response came with the same patient warmth that her mother had always used when addressing Rachel's doubts or fears. "I'm here, sweetheart, and I'm worried about you. You're pushing yourself too hard, trying to make up time that isn't worth risking your safety. Find a safe place to rest for a few hours." The maternal advice was exactly what Rachel's mother would have said in similar circumstances. Throughout Rachel's trucking career, her mother had been constantly concerned about the dangers of the profession and had regularly urged her daughter to prioritize safety over schedule pressures. Hearing that familiar guidance coming through the radio felt both comforting and deeply unsettling. Rachel pulled into the next rest area and tried to process what was happening. The voice had been completely authentic, capturing not only her mother's distinctive way of speaking, but also the specific kind of caring concern that had characterized their relationship. Yet her mother had never understood CB radio operations and wouldn't have known how to use the emergency frequency even when she was alive. "Mom, if this is really you, can you tell me something that only you would know?" Rachel asked tentatively, keying her microphone while feeling ridiculous for attempting to communicate with someone who had been buried 3 years earlier. You still have that little scar on your knee from when you fell off your bicycle trying to impress Tommy Morrison when you were 8 years old," came the immediate response. "And you never told your father that you were the one who backed his car into the mailbox when you were 16. You let him think it was vandalism." The specific memories were completely accurate, details that Rachel had never shared with anyone and that her mother had known only through direct experience or private conversations between them. The authentication was both convincing and terrifying, suggesting that some form of genuine communication had been established with her deceased parent. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon expanded to include other deceased family members. Rachel's grandfather, who had died when she was 12, began offering advice about mechanical problems and route planning using technical knowledge that he had possessed as a career mechanic. Her younger brother, killed in a car accident 5 years earlier, provided commentary on current events and family news with the same irreverent humor that had characterized his personality. "Rachel, this is Grandpa," came a transmission during a mechanical breakdown in Wyoming. "You've got a loose alternator belt that's causing your charging system to work intermittently. There's a parts store about 15 miles ahead where you can get a replacement. Don't try to drive much further without fixing it or you'll end up stranded with a dead battery." The mechanical advice was precisely correct and the parts store location was exactly as described. Rachel's grandfather had indeed been an expert mechanic who would have recognized the symptoms of a failing alternator belt immediately. The technical guidance provided through the radio was consistent with his expertise and his protective concern for Rachel's welfare. Her brother's communications were different in tone, but equally authentic to his personality. "Hey sis, you're listening to way too much depressing music on these long runs," his voice said with familiar teasing affection. "Try some of that jazz stuff you used to like in college, and call Mom's sister more often. She's lonely and she worries about you." The advice about contacting her aunt proved to be important, as Rachel discovered that her elderly relative had been dealing with health problems and could benefit from more frequent family contact. Her brother's guidance maintained the same balance of humor and genuine care that had characterized their relationship when he was alive. The family voices began appearing more frequently during times when Rachel was facing difficult decisions or experiencing emotional stress. When she was considering whether to change employers, her mother's voice provided detailed analysis of the pros and cons of different companies. When she was dealing with relationship problems, her grandfather offered perspective based on his years of marriage experience. "Sweetie, that man you've been dating isn't treating you with the respect you deserve," her mother's voice said during one particularly difficult period. "You're worth more than someone who cancels plans at the last minute and doesn't prioritize spending time with you. Don't settle for less than you deserve." The relationship advice was exactly what her mother would have offered, combining protective concern with encouragement for Rachel to maintain high standards for how she expected to be treated. The guidance helped Rachel recognize patterns in her dating life that weren't serving her well and encouraged her to seek healthier relationships. What made the communications even more remarkable was their apparent ability to provide current information about living family members. The voices would update Rachel on her cousin's career developments, her uncle's health concerns, and her grandmother's daily activities with accuracy that suggested ongoing observation rather than outdated knowledge from before their deaths. "Your cousin Jennifer just got engaged to that teacher she's been dating," her brother's voice reported during one conversation. "The wedding's planned for next spring and Grandma's already worrying about what to wear. You should call and congratulate Jenny. She's been hoping to hear from you." When Rachel contacted her cousin, she found that the engagement news was completely current and that Jennifer had indeed been hoping to hear from Rachel. The deceased family members seemed to maintain connections with the living relatives that allowed them to provide updated information about family developments. The communications gradually began to serve a therapeutic function, helping Rachel process grief that she hadn't fully addressed after losing multiple family members. The ongoing conversations allowed her to maintain relationships that death had interrupted, continuing to receive guidance and support from people who had been important influences in her life. "We're all proud of how you've handled the challenges you've faced," her mother's voice said during one particularly emotional conversation. "Losing us was hard, but you found ways to keep moving forward and building a good life for yourself. We love you, and we're always watching out for you." The validation and continuing love expressed through the radio communications helped Rachel feel less alone and more confident about her ability to handle life's difficulties. The family voices provided both practical assistance and emotional support that enhanced her resilience and well-being. Eventually, the communications became less frequent, appearing mainly during times of crisis or major life changes when Rachel most needed family guidance. The experience had taught her that love and family bonds could transcend death, providing ongoing protection and support that helped her navigate the challenges of independent adult life. Rachel never fully understood how the communications were possible, but she accepted them as a gift that helped her maintain connections with family members whose influence continued to shape her decisions and provide comfort during difficult times. The radio had become a bridge between the living and the dead, allowing relationships to continue in a modified form that honored both the reality of loss and the enduring power of family love. Story 16. Radio static spelling words in Morse code. The pattern in the static first caught Thomas's attention during a quiet night drive through Wyoming, when the usual white noise from his CB radio began displaying subtle rhythms that seemed too regular to be natural atmospheric interference. He was hauling electronics from Salt Lake City to Chicago, listening to Channel 6 for any interesting conversations, when the background static started pulsing in what sounded like intentional sequences of long and short bursts. Thomas had learned Morse code during his military service 15 years earlier, and although he was rusty with the details, he still recognized the distinctive rhythm of coded communication. The static patterns were definitely following Morse timing conventions, with clear distinctions between dots and dashes, appropriate spacing between letters, and longer pauses that indicated word breaks. At first, the coded messages in the static were simple: hello followed by driver, and then listening. Thomas grabbed a pen and paper and began transcribing the patterns, translating the dots and dashes back into letters as his memory of the code gradually returned. The process was slow and required intense concentration, but the messages were definitely coherent. Danger ahead, spelled out through the static, followed by mile 347 and ice bridge. Thomas checked his location and found that he was approaching mile 347, where the highway crossed a narrow bridge over a creek. The night was clear and the temperature was above freezing, so ice didn't seem likely, but the coded warning was specific enough to warrant caution. As Thomas approached the bridge, his headlights revealed exactly what the Morse code message had predicted. The bridge deck was covered with a thin layer of ice that had formed from water spray blown up from the creek below. The ice was nearly invisible against the dark pavement, creating precisely the kind of hazardous conditions that could cause a loaded truck to lose control. Thomas reduced his speed dramatically and crossed the bridge safely, but he realized that without the coded warning, he would have maintained normal highway speed and quite possibly would have lost control on the unexpected ice. The static transmitted Morse code had provided advance warning that had prevented a potentially serious accident. Over the following weeks, Thomas began monitoring his radio static more carefully, listening for the subtle patterns that indicated coded messages. The communications appeared irregularly, sometimes several times during a single trip, and sometimes not for days at a time. But when they did appear, the information was consistently accurate and helpful. Construction zone appeared in the static, followed by lane closure and mile 156 to 162. Thomas was currently approaching mile 150 on Interstate 80 in Nebraska, and the coded message proved to be completely accurate. The construction zone was exactly where indicated, with lane restrictions that would have caused significant delays if Thomas hadn't been prepared for them. The Morse code communications became more complex as Thomas's translation skills improved. Instead of simple warnings about immediate road conditions, the messages began providing detailed information about weather patterns, traffic problems, and mechanical issues that could affect his truck's performance. Check tire pressure, rear axle came through the static during a run through Colorado. Slow leak, left side dual. Thomas had been planning to conduct his routine inspection at the next truck stop, but the coded message convinced him to pull over immediately and check his tires. He found exactly what the message had described: a slow leak in one of his rear dual tires that would have led to a flat tire if not addressed promptly. The technical accuracy of the coded messages suggested that whoever was transmitting them had extensive knowledge of trucking operations and truck maintenance. The information covered everything from engine problems to load securement issues to route optimization, always providing details that were current and actionable. What made the communications even more intriguing was their apparent ability to predict problems before they became apparent through normal observation. The messages would warn about developing mechanical issues hours before symptoms appeared, advise about weather changes before they were reflected in official forecasts, and provide traffic information that proved to be more accurate than commercial traffic monitoring services. Storm system developing appeared in the static, followed by severe winds and seek shelter by 300. It was currently 11 p.m. and the weather was calm, but Thomas had learned to trust the coded warnings. He found a truck stop and parked his rig in a protected area just before 3 a.m., when severe winds began buffeting the area exactly as the message had predicted. The Morse code communications seemed to come from someone who was monitoring Thomas's specific routes and circumstances with remarkable attention to detail. The messages referenced his exact location, his current cargo, his truck's mechanical condition, and his personal schedule with accuracy that suggested ongoing surveillance or some kind of supernatural awareness. Family emergency came through the static, followed by call home and urgent. Thomas had been planning to call his wife later that evening, but the coded message convinced him to phone immediately. He learned that his father had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains and was asking for Thomas to come as soon as possible. The personal information contained in the coded messages was both helpful and disturbing. The unknown sender seemed to have access not only to Thomas's professional activities, but also to his family situations and personal concerns. The guidance was always beneficial, but the comprehensive knowledge implied by the messages raised questions about privacy and the source of the information. Thomas began trying to communicate back to the sender through Morse code transmissions of his own, tapping out messages on his microphone key using proper dot and dash timing. "Who are you?" he transmitted during one session, followed by, "How do you know this information?" The response came through the static within minutes: "Friend and protector," followed by, "Canelid comes from caring, and safety is primary conscience." The coded replies suggested that the sender's motivations were benevolent, but didn't provide any information about identity or methodology. Over several months, Thomas developed an ongoing coded conversation with the mysterious sender. The communications covered everything from technical trucking issues to personal advice about family relationships and career decisions. The unknown correspondent demonstrated remarkable wisdom and consistently provided guidance that improved Thomas's professional performance and personal well-being. Career opportunity coming appeared in the static, followed by Midwest company and better benefits. Within a week, Thomas was contacted by a trucking company based in Iowa that offered significantly better pay and working conditions than his current employer. The coded prediction had been completely accurate and had prepared him to take advantage of the opportunity. The Morse code communications gradually became less frequent as Thomas's life stabilized and his trucking skills improved under the influence of the mysterious guidance. The unknown sender seemed satisfied that Thomas had developed the expertise and judgment needed to handle most challenges independently. The final coded message came during Thomas's last run with his old trucking company. Mission accomplished, followed by safe travels, and now allege passes to next generation. Thomas understood that his period of receiving coded guidance was ending, but that he now had the responsibility to help other drivers develop similar skills and awareness. Thomas never identified the source of the Morse-coded messages in his radio static, but the experience had taught him to pay attention to subtle patterns and unusual phenomena that might contain important information. He became more observant, more safety-conscious, and more willing to help other drivers who reported strange experiences or mysterious guidance. The coded communications had connected him to a network of protection and mutual support that operated through channels that conventional understanding couldn't explain. Story 17. CB buzzing with insect-like chatter. The sound that emerged from Lisa's CB radio defied easy description, resembling a cross between the buzzing of a large swarm of insects and the rapid clicking of computer modems attempting to establish connections. It first appeared during a late-night haul through the Nevada desert, cutting through the normal static on Channel 14 with an intensity that made Lisa initially assume her radio equipment was malfunctioning. The buzzing was complex and layered, containing multiple frequencies and rhythms that seemed to weave together in patterns that suggested communication rather than random noise. There were periodic variations in tone and intensity that resembled the rise and fall of conversation, with some elements of the sound appearing to respond to others in ways that implied dialogue or information exchange. Lisa tried adjusting her radio settings, changing channels and checking her antenna connections, but the insect-like chatter continued regardless of her equipment modifications. The sound was definitely coming through the CB radio, rather than being generated by her truck's electrical systems, and it appeared to be strongest during the late-night hours, when most human radio traffic had diminished. As she listened more carefully over several nights, Lisa began to detect subtle patterns within the buzzing that suggested organized structure. Certain combinations of clicks and buzzes seemed to repeat at regular intervals, while other sequences appeared only in response to specific triggering patterns. The overall effect was like listening to a complex conversation conducted in a language that used insect-like sounds instead of human speech. The phenomenon became more intriguing when Lisa realized that the buzzing patterns seemed to correlate with actual conditions on the highway around her. When she was approaching areas with heavy traffic, the buzzing would intensify and become more urgent. When road conditions were hazardous due to weather or construction, the insect-like chatter would develop warning tones that seemed designed to attract attention. During one particularly striking example, the buzzing became almost frantic as Lisa approached a section of highway where an accident had occurred just minutes earlier. The insect-like sounds developed a sharp, staccato quality that seemed to communicate danger or emergency conditions. When Lisa finally encountered the accident scene, she realized that the buzzing had been providing advance warning about the hazardous situation. Lisa began experimenting with the buzzing by changing her driving patterns and observing how the sounds responded. When she increased her speed, certain elements of the chatter would become more rapid and intense. When she slowed down or changed lanes, different patterns would emerge that seemed to acknowledge her actions and provide feedback about their appropriateness. The insect-like communications appeared to be most active in areas where large numbers of trucks traveled regularly, as if the buzzing was somehow connected to the concentrated presence of commercial vehicles. The intensity and complexity of the sounds were greatest on major interstate highways and diminished significantly when Lisa traveled on secondary roads with lighter traffic. During one memorable night in Arizona, the buzzing developed what sounded like musical qualities, with harmonious combinations of tones that created an almost melodic effect. The insect-like orchestra seemed to be celebrating something, and Lisa eventually realized that the musical buzzing coincided with her successful completion of a particularly challenging mountain descent without any safety problems. The communications began to feel less alien and more supportive as Lisa developed familiarity with their patterns and rhythms. She started thinking of the buzzing as a kind of collective consciousness that included all the truck drivers who had traveled these highways over the years, their shared experiences somehow encoded into insect-like sounds that provided guidance and encouragement to current travelers. "I think you're trying to help me," Lisa said aloud to her radio during one session of particularly intense buzzing. The insect-like chatter immediately shifted to softer, more harmonious tones that seemed to confirm her interpretation and express approval of her understanding. Lisa began sharing her experiences with other drivers, describing the buzzing sounds and their apparent connection to highway conditions and driving safety. Most drivers listened politely but skeptically, though a few reported having heard similar phenomena on their own radios during late-night trips through remote areas. One driver named Carlos confirmed that he had encountered comparable insect-like sounds that seemed to provide warnings about developing weather conditions. Another driver, Susan, described buzzing patterns that had helped her locate rest areas and fuel stops during emergencies. The reports suggested that the phenomenon was more widespread than Lisa had initially realized. The buzzing communications reached their peak intensity during a dangerous ice storm that Lisa encountered while crossing the Rocky Mountains. The insect-like chatter became almost overwhelming in its urgency, providing constant feedback about road conditions, vehicle stability, and safe driving techniques. The sounds seemed to guide Lisa through the most treacherous sections of the storm, helping her maintain control of her truck when visibility was near zero and road surfaces were extremely hazardous. Throughout the storm, the buzzing provided what felt like step-by-step driving instructions, with different patterns indicating when to accelerate, when to brake, and when to adjust her steering. The guidance was remarkably effective, allowing Lisa to navigate safely through conditions that had caused multiple accidents for other drivers who didn't have access to the mysterious insect-like assistance. After successfully completing the dangerous mountain crossing, Lisa felt a new level of appreciation for the buzzing communications. What had initially seemed like random noise or equipment malfunction had proven to be a sophisticated guidance system that provided safety information more detailed and timely than any human dispatcher could offer. The insect-like chatter gradually became a regular part of Lisa's trucking routine, providing background communication that enhanced her awareness of highway conditions and potential hazards. She learned to interpret different types of buzzing patterns and to use the information to make better decisions about routing, timing, and driving techniques. Eventually, Lisa realized that the buzzing sounds were probably not actually produced by insects, but rather represented some kind of information processing system that used insect-like audio patterns to communicate complex data about highway conditions and vehicle operations. The specific mechanism remained mysterious, but the practical benefits were undeniable. The phenomenon continued for several years, gradually becoming less noticeable as Lisa developed better intuitive skills for recognizing dangerous conditions and making safe driving decisions. The insect-like communications had served as a kind of advanced training system that taught her to be more aware of subtle environmental cues and more responsive to changing conditions on the highway. Story 18. Radio orders you to stop and wait. The command came through Vincent's CB radio with the kind of authority that brooked no argument, cutting through the late-night static on Channel 12 with crystal clarity. Unit 73, stop your vehicle immediately and wait for further instructions. The voice was professional, male, and spoke with the confident tone of someone accustomed to having orders followed without question. Vincent checked his paperwork and dashboard. His unit number was indeed 73, though he hadn't been in radio contact with anyone who would know that information. He was currently hauling furniture from Atlanta to Nashville, driving through a quiet stretch of Tennessee Highway at 11:30 p.m., with virtually no other traffic visible in either direction. "Unknown caller, this is Unit 73, Vincent responded cautiously. "Please identify yourself and provide authority for traffic control instructions. I'm not currently under dispatch from any company using those protocols." The response was immediate and unwavering. "Unit 73, compliance with instructions is mandatory for your safety. Stop your vehicle at the next available location and await further guidance. This is not a request." The authoritative tone and specific knowledge of Vincent's unit number were compelling, but the mysterious nature of the instructions made him reluctant to comply without more information. He was making good time on his delivery schedule and had no apparent reason to stop driving. The highway conditions were excellent, his truck was operating normally, and there were no visible hazards that would justify an emergency stop. "Unknown caller, I need verification of your authority and explanation of the safety concern before I can comply with stopping instructions," Vincent replied, trying to maintain a professional tone while asserting his need for more information. "Unit 73, verification is not available through normal channels. The situation you are approaching cannot be detected through conventional monitoring systems. Stop your vehicle within the next 5 miles or face consequences that cannot be reversed." The ominous nature of the warning, combined with the caller's refusal to provide identification, created a dilemma that Vincent found increasingly stressful. The voice sounded completely legitimate and used appropriate radio protocols, but the mysterious circumstances made it impossible to verify whether the instructions were genuine or part of some kind of elaborate prank or malicious deception. Vincent decided to compromise by reducing his speed significantly while continuing to seek more information about the source and nature of the alleged safety concern. If there really was some kind of hazard ahead that conventional monitoring couldn't detect, proceeding slowly would provide more time to react to dangerous conditions while still allowing him to make progress toward his destination. "Unit 73, your speed reduction is acknowledged but insufficient," came the next transmission. "Complete stop is required within the next 2 miles. The hazard you are approaching involves temporal displacement effects that will transport your vehicle to an alternate timeline if you enter the affected zone while in motion." The explanation was so bizarre that Vincent almost dismissed it as evidence that he was dealing with someone who was either mentally unstable or deliberately trying to confuse him with science fiction scenarios. Temporal displacement and alternate timelines were concepts from fantasy movies, not legitimate safety concerns that professional drivers needed to address. But something about the caller's unwavering confidence and technical-sounding terminology made Vincent reconsider his skepticism. The voice continued to use proper radio protocols and displayed detailed knowledge of his location and circumstances that would be difficult for a casual prankster to obtain. Vincent pulled over at a highway rest area 2 miles ahead, deciding that the potential consequences of ignoring a genuine safety warning outweighed the inconvenience of an unexplained delay. The rest area was empty except for his truck, and the silence of the rural Tennessee night was broken only by the gentle hum of his diesel engine and the distant sound of crickets. "Unit 73, compliance is confirmed," came the immediate response from the mysterious voice. "Remain stationary for the next 47 minutes while the temporal disturbance passes through your intended route. Do not attempt to resume travel until you receive clearance." Vincent settled in to wait, using the forced break to update his logbook and check his cargo securement. The 47-minute time specification was oddly precise, and he found himself watching his clock to see whether anything unusual would happen when the specified period ended. As the minutes passed, Vincent began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere around the rest area. The air seemed to shimmer slightly, creating visual distortions that resembled heat mirages but occurred despite the cool nighttime temperatures. The sound of insects and night birds gradually faded, replaced by an unnatural silence that felt somehow empty and expectant. At the 30-minute mark, more dramatic phenomena began to manifest. The lights in the rest area began flickering in patterns that didn't correspond to normal electrical fluctuations. Vincent's truck instruments showed brief, inexplicable readings that suggested impossible conditions: fuel levels that changed randomly, speedometer readings that showed motion while the vehicle was stationary, and temperature gauges that fluctuated wildly without corresponding changes in actual engine conditions. The most unsettling effect was the way time itself seemed to become unreliable. Vincent's watch, his truck's clock, and his cell phone all showed different times that changed at inconsistent rates. Minutes would pass quickly during some intervals and seem to stretch endlessly during others, creating a disorienting sense that normal temporal flow had been disrupted. Unit 73, you are now observing peripheral effects of the temporal disturbance, came an update from the mysterious voice. The main phenomenon is currently passing through the highway approximately 12 miles ahead of your location. Vehicles that entered the affected zone while in motion have been displaced to parallel timeline branches. Vincent looked down the highway and could see what appeared to be a section where the normal landscape was replaced by shimmering distortion effects that made it impossible to distinguish specific features. The distortion seemed to be moving slowly along the highway corridor, affecting a zone that appeared to be several miles wide. As the 47-minute deadline approached, the unusual phenomena began to subside. The air distortions faded, normal insect sounds resumed, and the lights stopped flickering. Vincent's instruments returned to normal readings, and his various timepieces synchronized themselves to show the same time once again. Unit 73, temporal disturbance has passed, came the final transmission from the authoritative voice. Resume normal travel. Your cooperation has prevented displacement to an alternate timeline where your delivery would not have been possible. Vincent waited an additional few minutes to ensure that conditions had completely returned to normal, then resumed his journey toward Nashville. The remainder of his trip was completely routine, with no unusual phenomena or communication from the mysterious voice that had ordered him to stop and wait. Upon reaching his destination, Vincent tried to research whether other drivers had reported similar experiences with temporal disturbances or mysterious traffic control instructions. He found a few scattered accounts of drivers who claimed to have encountered unexplained delays that had prevented them from entering areas where unusual accidents or disappearances had occurred, but nothing that specifically mentioned temporal displacement effects. Vincent never received another command from the mysterious voice, but the experience had taught him to take unusual warnings seriously, even when they couldn't be verified through normal channels. The 47-minute delay had apparently saved him from some kind of phenomenon that conventional understanding couldn't explain, and the authoritative voice had demonstrated knowledge of dangers that extended beyond normal traffic safety concerns. Story 19, Transmission of Accidents Before They Occur. The accident report came through Sarah's CB radio with the professional tone and detailed specificity that characterized official emergency communications. Multi-vehicle collision at mile marker 267 on I-75, northbound. 3 commercial vehicles and 4 passenger cars involved. 2 fatalities confirmed. Multiple serious injuries. Emergency services en route. All northbound traffic will be diverted at exit 265. Sarah checked her location and realized that mile marker 267 was approximately 15 miles ahead of her current position. The accident report was remarkably detailed for such a recent incident, including specific information about the number of vehicles involved, casualty counts, and traffic management plans that would normally take considerable time to compile and verify. Emergency services, this is Sarah in the red Kenworth at mile 252, she responded on Channel 9. Can you confirm the status of the accident at 267? I'm not seeing any emergency vehicles heading northbound and traffic appears to be flowing normally. There was no response to her query, which was unusual for genuine emergency communications. Official emergency services typically acknowledged inquiries from drivers who might be affected by traffic incidents. Sarah tried contacting State Highway Patrol and commercial traffic monitoring services, but none had any reports of accidents in the area described by the mysterious radio transmission. As Sarah approached mile marker 267, she found the highway completely clear with normal traffic flow in both directions. There was no evidence of any accident, no emergency vehicles, and no indication that the multi-vehicle collision described in the radio report had actually occurred. The detailed emergency broadcast appeared to have been describing a fictional incident. But 24 hours later, while Sarah was returning southbound on the same stretch of highway, she witnessed the exact accident that had been described in the previous day's radio transmission. At mile marker 267, a multi-vehicle collision developed involving 3 commercial vehicles and 4 passenger cars, with casualty and injury counts that matched the advance report precisely. The accident unfolded exactly as the mysterious radio transmission had predicted, from the initial vehicle interactions that caused the collision to the specific pattern of emergency service response. Sarah realized that she had somehow received an accurate accident report 24 hours before the incident actually occurred. Over the following months, Sarah began paying closer attention to accident reports that came through her CB radio, carefully noting the details and checking whether the described incidents actually existed at the time of transmission. What she discovered was a pattern of prophetic accident reports that consistently described genuine incidents 24 to 48 hours before they occurred. The advance accident reports were remarkably accurate, providing precise location information, detailed descriptions of the vehicles and people involved, and specific casualty counts that proved to be correct when the actual incidents eventually took place. The reports used proper emergency service protocols and included the kind of technical details that would only be available to official responders who had conducted thorough investigations. Fatal rollover accident on Highway 20 eastbound at mile 134, came one typical report. Single commercial vehicle carrying hazardous materials. Driver failed to negotiate curve due to excessive speed. Vehicle overturned and caught fire. Highway closed indefinitely for hazmat cleanup. Driver pronounced dead at scene. Sarah made note of the report's details and checked the specified location the following day. She found no evidence of any accident, but when she passed through the same area 2 days later, emergency crews were cleaning up the exact incident that the radio report had described, with all details matching perfectly. The prophetic accident reports began to serve as an early warning system that allowed Sarah to modify her routes and schedules to avoid areas where serious incidents were predicted to occur. When she received advance reports about accidents on her planned route, she would take alternate highways or delay her travel timing to ensure she wouldn't be in the vicinity when the incidents actually happened. The strategy proved remarkably effective at keeping Sarah away from dangerous situations. She avoided several multi-vehicle accidents, hazardous material spills, and severe weather incidents by following the guidance provided in the prophetic radio transmissions. The advance accident reports had become a valuable safety tool that enhanced her ability to navigate America's highways without encountering the most serious hazards. What made the phenomenon even more intriguing was the apparent attempt by the mysterious radio source to prevent the predicted accidents from occurring. The advance reports often included specific details about the causes of the incidents, providing information that could theoretically be used to warn the drivers who would be involved. A commercial vehicle driver named Rodriguez will experience brake failure on I-40 westbound at mile 89 tomorrow at approximately 2:15 p.m., came one particularly detailed report. Failure will occur due to overheated brake system from prolonged mountain descent. Driver will attempt to use runaway truck ramp but will miss the entrance due to excessive speed. Sarah spent considerable time trying to locate a driver named Rodriguez who might be planning to travel through the specified area at the predicted time. She contacted trucking companies, monitored CB radio frequencies, and even posted warnings at truck stops. hoping to reach the driver, who was destined to experience brake failure. Her efforts were partially successful. She managed to contact a driver named Rodriguez, who was indeed planning to travel westbound on I-40 the following day. When she warned him about the predicted brake failure, he was initially skeptical but agreed to conduct extra thorough brake inspections and to reduce his speed on mountain descents. The additional precautions proved to be unnecessary because the brake failure occurred exactly as predicted, despite Rodriguez's careful preparation. However, his reduced speed allowed him to successfully use the runaway truck ramp, avoiding the serious accident that the original report had described. The prophetic warning had enabled a modification of the incident's outcome, even though it couldn't prevent the mechanical failure itself. This experience convinced Sarah that the prophetic accident reports were not just providing advance information, but were actively attempting to reduce the severity of predicted incidents by enabling preventive actions. The mysterious radio source seemed to be working to minimize casualties and damage by providing warnings that could influence driver behavior. Sarah began developing a network of contacts throughout the trucking community who helped her distribute warnings based on the prophetic accident reports. When she received advance information about incidents involving specific drivers or routes, her network would attempt to locate the affected parties and provide safety warnings that could modify the predicted outcomes. The collaborative effort achieved mixed results. Some drivers were receptive to the warnings and took appropriate precautions that reduced their risk of involvement in the predicted incidents. Others were skeptical of the supernatural source of the information and continued with their original plans, often experiencing exactly the accidents that had been foretold. The most successful interventions occurred when the prophetic reports provided specific information about environmental conditions that could be addressed through route changes or timing modifications. Weather accidents, construction zone incidents, and traffic pattern problems could often be avoided entirely by following the guidance contained in the advance reports. Multiple vehicle accident will occur during fog conditions on Highway 101 near Eureka tomorrow morning between 6:30 and 7:00 a.m., read one report that led to particularly effective prevention efforts. Visibility will drop to less than 50 feet due to marine layer movement inland. Recommend all commercial traffic delay departure until after 8:00 a.m. Sarah's network was able to contact several trucking companies that had scheduled early morning deliveries in the Eureka area, convincing them to delay their drivers' departures based on the prophetic fog warning. When marine layer conditions developed exactly as predicted, the highway experienced multiple accidents involving vehicles whose drivers hadn't received the advance warning, while the commercial trucks that had delayed their travel avoided involvement entirely. The prophetic accident reports continued for several years, providing Sarah with an unusual form of supernatural guidance that enhanced her safety and allowed her to help other drivers avoid dangerous situations. The advance information had transformed her understanding of highway safety from a reactive process based on current conditions to a predictive approach that could anticipate and prevent problems before they developed. Eventually, the prophetic reports became less frequent and finally stopped entirely. Sarah theorized that the mysterious radio source had accomplished its mission of teaching her and her network to be more proactive about safety planning and hazard recognition. The supernatural guidance had served as advanced training that developed skills and awareness that continued to benefit drivers long after the prophetic transmissions ended. Sarah never identified the source of the advance accident reports, but the experience had taught her that highway safety involved forces and information sources that extended beyond conventional monitoring systems. The prophetic radio transmissions had connected her to a network of protection and early warning that operated according to principles that normal understanding couldn't explain, but whose practical benefits were undeniably real. Story 20. Channel that leads drivers into traps. The friendly voice on Channel 38 offered exactly the kind of help that weary truck driver Michael needed during a difficult run through unfamiliar territory in rural Arkansas. He had been driving for 12 hours with a load of machinery from Little Rock to Memphis, following GPS directions through back roads that seemed to wind endlessly through heavily forested areas where cellular service was spotty and road signs were infrequent. "Hey there, driver. Sounds like you're having some navigation troubles," came the helpful voice when Michael expressed frustration about confusing route directions. "I know this area like the back of my hand. Been driving these roads for 25 years. I can guide you to a shortcut that'll save you 2 hours and get you back to main highways where the driving's easier." The offer was exactly what Michael had been hoping to hear. His delivery schedule was tight, and the winding back roads were adding significant time to his journey. Local knowledge from an experienced driver who understood the area's road network could be invaluable for finding more efficient routing. "That would be great," Michael responded gratefully. "I'm currently on Highway 167, about 30 miles south of Little Rock, heading east toward Memphis. These back roads are killing my schedule." "Perfect. I know exactly where you are," the helpful voice replied. "Take the next right turn onto County Road 15. It's not marked very well, so watch for a big oak tree with a reflector nailed to it. That road will take you through some beautiful country and connect back to Highway 40 about 50 miles ahead." Michael found the turn exactly as described and followed County Road 15 through increasingly remote forest land. The road was narrower than he had expected for a recommended truck route, but it was paved and seemed to be in reasonable condition. The helpful voice on Channel 38 continued to provide turn-by-turn directions, maintaining friendly conversation that made the isolated drive more pleasant. "You're doing great," the voice encouraged. "In about 5 miles, you'll see a turnoff to the left marked with a wooden sign for Miller's Creek Bridge. Take that turn and follow the road for another 10 miles. It gets a little rough in places, but it's definitely passable for commercial vehicles." The Miller's Creek Bridge Road was significantly narrower and more challenging than the previous route, with sharp curves that required careful maneuvering and some sections where overhanging tree branches scraped against Michael's trailer. But the helpful voice continued to provide reassurance and guidance, insisting that the difficult section would soon open up into easier driving. "Just a little bit further," the voice said when Michael expressed concern about the increasingly challenging road conditions. "I know this route seems rough, but it opens up into a straight shot that connects directly to the interstate. You'll save hours compared to staying on the main highways with all their traffic and construction delays." Michael continued following the directions despite growing unease about the route's suitability for commercial vehicles. The road was becoming progressively narrower and more difficult, with surfaces that seemed poorly maintained and drainage problems that created muddy conditions in several locations. When Michael reached what appeared to be a dead end in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, he realized that he had been deliberately misled by the helpful voice on Channel 38. There was no connection to Highway 40, no shortcut to Memphis, and no easy way to turn his large truck around in the confined space. "Channel 38, I've reached what appears to be a dead end," Michael called on his radio. "There's no continuation of the route you described, and I'm in a very difficult position for maneuvering my truck." The response came with a tone that was completely different from the previous helpful guidance. "Sorry, driver, but you're exactly where I wanted you to be. That clearing is the perfect place for my friends to inspect your cargo and see if there's anything worth taking. Don't try to resist, and nobody will get hurt." Michael realized that he had fallen victim to an elaborate trap designed to lure commercial vehicles into remote locations where they could be robbed without interference from law enforcement or other drivers. The friendly voice had used detailed local knowledge and professional trucking terminology to gain his trust and lead him into an isolated area where he would be vulnerable to criminal activity. The situation was extremely dangerous, but Michael's years of trucking experience had taught him to remain calm under pressure and look for opportunities to escape from difficult situations. He began examining the clearing more carefully, looking for ways to maneuver his truck despite the confined space and challenging terrain. Michael discovered that the clearing was larger than it had initially appeared, with a narrow path on the far side that might allow him to continue forward rather than attempting to turn around. The path looked questionable for commercial vehicle access, but it might provide an escape route if he could navigate it successfully. "I'm going to try to move forward through that path," Michael announced on his CB radio, hoping that other drivers might hear his transmission and be aware of his situation. "If anyone is monitoring Channel 19, I'm in a remote area of Arkansas and may need assistance from law enforcement." As Michael began maneuvering his truck toward the narrow path, several men emerged from the forest and began approaching his vehicle. Their intentions were clearly threatening, and Michael realized that his escape attempt needed to be executed quickly and decisively. Michael accelerated his truck through the narrow path, using his vehicle's size and weight to push through obstacles and vegetation that blocked the route. The path was extremely challenging, with overhanging branches that damaged his trailer and muddy sections that threatened to bog down his truck. But he managed to maintain forward momentum. The narrow path eventually connected to another forest road that was in better condition and allowed Michael to increase his speed and put distance between himself and the men who had been approaching his truck. He continued following the forest road until it eventually connected to a major highway where he could contact law enforcement about the attempted robbery. Michael reported the incident to state police and provided detailed information about the location of the trap and the radio frequency that had been used to lure him into the dangerous situation. The investigation revealed that several commercial vehicles had been robbed in similar circumstances, with criminals using CB radio communications to identify potential targets and guide them into remote locations. The experience taught Michael to be more skeptical of unsolicited routing advice from unknown sources, especially when the suggested routes involved remote areas or roads that weren't clearly marked as truck routes. He began verifying routing information through multiple sources and avoiding suggestions that would take him into isolated areas where help wouldn't be readily available. Michael shared his experience with other drivers through trucking forums and CB radio networks, warning them about the tactics used by criminals who posed as helpful drivers to lure victims into traps. The information helped other truckers recognize and avoid similar situations, reducing the effectiveness of criminal operations that relied on deceiving drivers through fake assistance. The incident also highlighted the importance of maintaining communication with dispatchers and other drivers when traveling through unfamiliar or remote areas. Michael's CB radio transmissions during the escape attempt had been monitored by other drivers who were able to provide additional assistance by contacting law enforcement and providing information about his location. Years later, Michael would occasionally monitor Channel 38 to see if the criminal operation was still active. He never heard the same helpful voice that had led him into the trap, but the experience had made him permanently more cautious about trusting routing advice from unknown sources, and more aware of the potential dangers that existed in remote areas of America's highway system. The incident had transformed Michael from a trusting driver who appreciated help from fellow truckers into a more suspicious and careful professional who verified information independently and maintained constant awareness of potential threats. The criminal trap had failed in its immediate objective, but had succeeded in making Michael a more security-conscious driver who was better prepared to avoid dangerous situations in the future.